Chapter 16. Aaaaand. For a long moment, Aaaaand, Istvay, the raider scientist, and the captain stood staring at each other. Then the captain stepped towards them, pulling a long knife out of his belt, a dangerous grin on his face. The scientist threw herself forward, landing just in time to plant herself between the captain and Aaaaand as he and Istvay scrambled to their feet. "No!" she shouted. "You can't kill them! Do you know how long it took me to get 2 live specimens?" Aaaaand recognized the panic in her voice. She grabbed the captain's wrist as the knife came down, and Aaaaand leapt back out of the way, holding tightly onto Aaand, who was hissing on his shoulder. "Listen, Desi, I'm sure we can find you some more," the captain was saying, struggling to extricate himself from the frantic scientist. From behind him, one of the other raiders, dressed in the same uniform as the captain minus the cape, stepped forward and grabbed Istvay by the arm. Istvay swore helplessly as the raider dragged them towards the door, already pulling out a knife. Aaaaand leapt after them and grabbed the raider by the shoulder, even though she was a solid 20 centimeters taller than he was, and jerked her around. "You can damn well take your hands off, Istvay," he snapped, and snatched up a beaker from the table beside him, smashing it across the raider's face. Istvay stared at him. The raider staggered back, looking more surprised than hurt, but her hand loosened from Istvay's arm. Aaaaand grabbed his friend, pulling them around behind him, and yanked out his pulse pistol. His heart was pounding, his hands shaking with adrenaline, but no one was bloody well going to touch Istvay, not while he was alive to prevent it. And then Aaand, who he'd let go of in the struggle, launched herself off his shoulder, landing on another raider who'd come around behind him, their long knife raised. The raider behind him gave a grunt of surprise, and Aaaaand half-turned, his attention split between the raider he'd hit, now apparently recovered and after his blood, and Aaand. "Aaand!" he started. Then the raider in front of him grabbed for Istvay again. Aaaaand snatched up a long pole that was probably a delicate piece of scientific equipment and swung it with all his strength, connecting hard with the raider's ribcage. The raider staggered back, eyes wide with astonishment. "Stay the hell away from Istvay!" Aaaaand snapped, bringing the pole back for another swing. In the background, he could hear the scientist and the captain shouting at each other, and the raider Aaand had landed on was spitting muffled curses. The raider growled something and yanked out a knife to slash at the furious land devil. "No!" Aaaaand shouted. "Don't do that! She'll—" It was too late. The raider brought down the knife. Aaand spat. There was a moment of silence. Then the raider dropped to the ground, screaming and writhing as steam hissed up from his protective suit. "Aaand! Get over here!" Aaaaand snapped, his heart in his mouth. Aaand spat at her victim again, then sulkily wriggled across the floor to latch herself onto Aaaaand's trouser leg. The entire crew of raiders had gone silent as their companions' screams faded to a muffled gurgling. "Aaand!" Aaaaand said sternly into the silence, his heart pounding sickeningly in his chest. "Aaand, you know better. He wouldn't have been able to hurt you with that knife, and you know it. There was no reason for you to—" He trailed off. Everyone in the room was staring at him. Aaaaand said uncomfortably, glancing around. I'm sorry about that. I was trying to warn your friend not to—" The words sank into the silence like stones into a still lake. At last, carefully, the raider captain broke the silence. "What in God's name," he said, "is that thing?" Aaaaand glanced guiltily over at Aaand, who had made her grumbling way up his leg to perch on her usual place on his shoulder. She's a land devil." It didn't seem quite like enough of an explanation, but then he wasn't sure what he could say to salvage a situation like this. "She's my pet. She's normally very well behaved. It's just she doesn't like it when people threaten me or my friend, so—" The raider captain was still staring at him. That thing is your pet." Aaaaand nodded, not quite meeting his eye. There were another few moments of silence. And then the raider captain burst into hearty peals of laughter. Aaaaand stared as the captain bent over, howling and wiping at his eyes. No one else in the small shelter moved or spoke. Aaaaand exchanged glances with Istvay, but they seemed just as confused as he was. He edged closer to them. "Listen," he whispered. "They all have body armor on, but if they're afraid of Ani, we might be able to..." The raider captain held up a hand, still doubled over with laughter. At last he straightened, wiping his eyes and hiccuping with the remnants of mirth. "I'm sorry," he said, the words wheezing from repressed laughter. "I'm very sorry. If I'd known you were such ferocious warriors, there's no way I would have tried to eat you." He turned to the scientist. "Desi?" His tone was still thick with mirth. "You said these are specimens you wanted to study?" The scientist's eyes were wide, and she was staring between Aaaaand, Ani, the body on the floor, and the captain. She swallowed and nodded. "The whole point of sending that box through the portal was to initiate contact. I need humans that the Yibo haven't domesticated if I want to do a proper study to round out my observations, and this may be my only chance. Like I've told you 100 times, they're a sapient species. By learning more about their natural habitat and their behaviors..." The captain waved a dismissive hand. "Yes, yes." He glanced at Aaaaand and Istvay, and Aaaaand could see, under his laughter, the dangerous glint in his red eyes as he studied them. "It appears you picked some impressive specimens," he said at last. "I can admire that. And here I thought humans were just a sort of especially stupid version of the Yibo. You say you need these particular humans?" Desi nodded. There was a stubborn look to her face that told Aaaaand she was willing to leap in front of them again if necessary. The captain grinned and turned to Aaaaand and Istvay. "I suppose, then, we may as well get acquainted." Began Aaaaand, his eyes flicking to the dead raider on the floor. The acid was now foaming a weak, greenish color. The raider captain snorted dismissively. He knew better than to try to go after prey I'd marked. He gestured, and 2 of the raiders stepped forward, grabbing the body by the shoulders and the ankles, and dragged it out the door. The captain turned his attention back to them, smiling in a way that showed his sharp incisors to full advantage. "All right, then. I am Captain Kravai. These people here are my crew. I won't bother introducing them all. I'm sure you'll get to know them as time goes by. And this. Here." He grabbed the scientist, pulling her in for an affectionate one-armed hug that she squirmed out of indignantly. "Is our resident scientist. She's very peaceful, as I'm sure you noticed. And she's fascinated by humans. She hasn't killed a single person yet, not even a Yibo." He cupped a hand to his mouth as if whispering a secret. "That's why she's got short hair. Never killed anyone and earned the right to grow it out. She's practically a vegetarian." The scientist glared at him and brushed herself off haughtily. "We adopted her when we took the ship she was raised on, but they treated her like a servant anyways. No love lost. And now she's our good luck charm. We let her do her experiments here in her lab to keep busy, and the rest of the raiders know the mountain is out of bounds to anyone but us. Had to kill a few crews and burn out a few ships to get the message across, but everyone stays away now. And our little scientist can work away as peacefully as she pleases." He reached out to give the scientist another affectionate squeeze, but she stepped out of reach huffily. Again, Aaaaand and Istvay exchanged glances. No wonder the raiders who'd been chasing them had turned around when he and Istvay stepped onto the mountain. From the captain's nonchalant attitude towards death, it seemed getting on his bad side would be a very permanent bad decision. "And now, who are you?" the captain asked, turning to Aaaaand. There was a dangerous glint in his red eyes. Aaaaand cleared his throat. I'm Aaaaand Romeau. I'm also a scientist." The captain stared at him, then burst into a fresh wave of laughter. "A human scientist! Look, Desi, the humans have scientists too. Maybe you were right all along." Desi shot Aaaaand an apologetic look, like a teenager embarrassed by their parent. "Anyways, Aaand continued awkwardly, as the captain was obviously waiting for him to go on. This is Ani. She's very friendly once you get to know her. And, this is Istvay. They're my friend and my research assistant. The captain frowned. I see. And Ani, she's a larval stage? Or is that how the mature females look? And you and your Istvay are males. I haven't seen one that looks like her before, but then Desi, in the corner, looked like she was choking. Aaand stared, then had to fight to keep his face straight. No, I mean, yes, I'm a male, but Istvay's not. They're non-binary. And Ani she's a different species. The human genders all look roughly similar. The captain raised his eyebrows and nodded. Ah, I see. So we have a scientist and a research assistant, and whatever that is, and a male, a non-binary, and a female. He turned to Desi with a grin. You were very thorough in your samples. The creature is not a human female, snapped Desi, annoyance in her tone. She glanced at Aaand. A great tree-dwelling, venomous, tentacled land devil, Aaand muttered. He had completely lost the thread of the conversation at this point. Of course, said the captain breezily, just like I was saying. We have Aaand, and his Ani, and his Istvay. They're not my Istvay, said Aaand in some irritation. The captain raised his eyebrows in mild surprise. You're not mates. Aaand stared at him blankly. You know? Mates, said the captain patiently. You know? Like... He made an unmistakable gesture with his fingers. Aaand coughed abruptly, not daring to glance over at Istvay. No, we're not mates. Ah, said the captain, sounding mildly disappointed. For a few moments, they stood there staring at each other. At last, the captain grinned again. So, Aaand, what brought you and your Istvay and your Ani here? I told you, they're not my... Aaand began, then gave up. Desi sent something through the portal that had a blood sample in it. We were looking for the person the sample was taken from. The captain looked confused. Desi cleared her throat and looked away, appearing slightly embarrassed. You told me you needed a sample to check my blood sugar levels, Krivai said, turning on her with lowered eyebrows. She didn't appear intimidated. Well, I needed a sample to send through, and I couldn't have all the samples be from me. If I wanted someone to respond to me, they couldn't think I was the only inhabitant of the entire system. He was still glaring. She cast a resigned glance at Aaand. And besides, she continued grudgingly, I wanted blood samples from someone who was a strong physical specimen. The captain watched her suspiciously for a moment, then he beamed and turned back to Aaand. Well, it looks like you found him, then. Why were you interested in the blood sample? Asked Desi, frowning. I assume you weren't studying us independent of what I sent through. If you're interested in doing some analyses, you and I could... Actually, Aaand broke in, He paused, glancing around, then sighed. It's just... There's a genetic mutation endemic in our population. I don't know where it came from, but it's been there for a long time. It's a combination of several genes, as best we've figured out, which means it's difficult to test for, and also that most of the population is a potential carrier. But when someone has the defect, they die, usually within 20 or 30 years. We've never been able to find a cure. Even now, he could hardly speak the words without his throat tightening. He cleared his throat. Anyway, the blood sample you sent, we did DNA analysis on it when it got to our planet. The captain has the same combination of genes that causes the genetic defect, and he's at least 2 decades older in our planet's time than the longest any survivor of the defect has lived back in the Joias System. I'd hoped that maybe, if I could do some analysis, perform some studies. Do you have this defect? The captain asked, frowning. Aaand shook his head mutely, unable to speak. The captain's frown deepened. But one of you do, don't they? It's your Ani or your Istvay, isn't it? Yes, said Istvay at last. They hadn't spoken during this entire exchange, But now they stepped forward, placing themselves between the captain and Aaaaand. Yes, it's me. So if there's a problem, I'm the one you should talk to. Aaaaand was doing all this for me. The captain was still frowning, glancing between Aaaaand and Istvay. No, of course, he said at last. I wondered why the three of you were willing to seek us out. He glanced over at the scientist, and a wordless communication passed between them. She nodded, and he turned back to Aaaaand and Istvay, grinning. Well, he said, you want to know about this genetic defect, and Desi wants to know about you. And I heard rumors that Captain Sharda is prowling around the base of my scientist's mountain, hunting for some rogue humans, and she's been testing my strength for a while now. So I think I've found a solution that will make all of us happy. You will stay here with us. You can do your research or tests or whatever, and Desi can study you to her heart's content, and no one will bother you unless they want my crew to hunt them down. My crew has a reputation among the other raiders. His smile widened, and there was an unmistakable menace under it. And next time I talk to Sharda, I'll be able to rub it in her face a bit. She's begun to think a little too highly of herself lately. Aaaaand stared. Istvay recovered themselves first. That sounds very nice, they said, and Aaaaand could hear the challenge in their tone. In fairness, Istvay had never been particularly tactful when they were injured, and in this case he could hardly blame them. We stay here, and your scientist does studies. I assume her studies will be on us? The captain smiled benevolently. Well, of course, but she doesn't want to hurt you. I'm sure they'll all be harmless. Istvay gave the captain their signature glare. Oh yes, I'm sure they will. And what exactly do you get in exchange for all this? Food storage for when hunting is bad? The captain burst into uproarious laughter again. Aaaaand, he said, when he'd recovered somewhat. Your Istvay is very fierce. Aaaaand turned his own glare on the captain. He probably should be more polite right now, but after everything that had happened, he quite frankly couldn't bring himself to care. Listen, he said through his teeth. They're not my Istvay. They're their own person, and you can damn well... The captain held up a hand, still chuckling. I apologize, Aaaaand, he said. I didn't mean to offend you. I am deeply happy to have you as part of our crew. Aaaaand and Istvay exchanged glances again. Part of your... began Aaaaand uncertainly. Part of my crew, said the captain. It's been a long time since I've met anyone who's made me laugh this much. We'll make sure you have food and clean water, a comfortable place to sleep. You can be our mascots. I'm sure the crew will love you. He grinned, showing his teeth. And Sharda will be spitting blood. Your mascots. Aaaaand could hear the incredulity in his own voice. We're their food storage, said Istvay flatly. This is ridiculous. We don't have to... Not food storage, I swear it, the captain said jovially. Desi is always asking me for something we can adopt, but it's so hard to find a creature that would fit into the crew. Aaaaand turned to Istvay. Pishti, he's right. This isn't about food storage. He's damn well keeping us as pets. Istvay glanced between Aaaaand and the captain, their eyebrows raised almost to their hairline. They sounded like they couldn't decide whether to laugh or start shouting. That's what this is, isn't it? You want to keep us as pets, said Aaaaand, half in disbelief, turning back to the captain. The captain chuckled. Don't be silly. Of course you won't be our pets. You'll be members of our crew. I'm not a pet, said Aaaaand through his teeth. His heart was still pounding far too quickly from the too many near-death experiences to count that he'd suffered over the last hour. And nor is Istvay. Of course you're not a pet, said the captain soothingly. You're a member of our crew, just like any other member of the crew. One of the raider crew stepped through the door, eyeing them suspiciously. Captain, you sent for me? Yes, said the captain over his shoulder. I need you to prepare that spare cabin on the ship. Make sure it's got food and clean water and some bedding so they can make their little nests or whatever they need. Talk to Desi when we're done here. I want to make their habitat as accurate as possible so they can adjust. Our habitat? said Aaand flatly. They're not doing sex with each other, the captain continued. At least, that's what Aaand said. I don't really know human mating habits, but I think it's all right to put them in the same habitat anyways. They seem to get along. He turned back to Aaand and Istvay, peering at them. You do get along, don't you? If we put you in the same room, you won't fight or eat each other or something? Humans live in complex social groupings, said Desi importantly, stepping forward. These two look like they've formed their own social grouping with each other and their land devil, so they should be fine. And humans have complex methods of communication, so there are usually some warning signals before they resort to dangerous levels of violence within their chosen social grouping. At least generally speaking, she added, glancing suspiciously at Aaand and Istvay, as if worried they might start a fistfight in the middle of her laboratory. Good, good, said the captain, turning back to the newcomer. Then that's how we'll arrange it. Listen, began Aaand again, helplessly. We're not pets. We're... Of course you're not pets, said the captain soothingly. You're scientists. Human scientists. He seemed to be trying to hold back laughter at the words. Aaand glared at him, his entire body still buzzing with adrenaline. Listen, he began. As soon as you get settled in, come back here to my lab, and we can start looking at some information on the DNA. Desi broke in. I suggest we start by taking some of Istvay's blood, and we'll compare it to the captain's. You can show me the DNA markers for the defect, and we'll see if we can figure anything out. Aaand turned to the scientist quickly, his annoyance forgotten in an instant. Do you have a DNA analysis machine here? He asked. His heart beat with a mixture of excitement and a sort of frantic disbelief. I keep the more delicate machines in the back, but yes, I certainly have the equipment for basic DNA analysis. If we can pinpoint the genetic differences, perhaps we can figure out what exactly this defect is and why it doesn't affect us like it affects humans. She cleared her throat importantly. Since we almost certainly have genetics in common, there's a high possibility that we'll be able to figure something out. Aaand's legs went weak with relief. Istvay grabbed his shoulder in support, but when Aaand looked at them, they didn't look any better than he felt, face pale, eyes wide with shock. You can do that tomorrow, the captain broke in firmly. Look at them. They look like they're about to fall over. Aaand should have finished fixing up some bedding for them. They need sleep, and it looks like they've been injured. You don't want damaged specimens, do you? Desi's eyes widened, and she glanced quickly at Aaand and Istvay. I didn't even notice. Yes, of course. Let's get them food and rest, and I'll see what I can find as far as medicine that should work with their biology. She turned, rummaging through her shelves and muttering to herself. I'm fine, actually, Aaand began. I'm not tired at all. We can start setting things up right now. No, said the captain firmly, stepping over to them. Ani hissed, but it was half-hearted, as if she'd decided the captain no longer posed a threat. It won't be nearly as satisfying to gloat to Sharda about you if you're dead. Besides, you won't find a cure for your Istvay if you're falling asleep standing up. Go on, you can do your little science in the morning. Istvay glanced at Aaand with a rueful smile. Their face was pale, and their expression still held a dazed, sickly look of exhaustion. I hate to say it, Aaand, they said quietly, but I agree with the raiders on this one. Aaand and Istvay were led to a small, comfortable cabin on the large raider ship now parked in the center of the clearing. Aaand tried not to think about how much time the raiders must spend in space if their home was the ship itself. He could worry about that when it came to it. Right now there was only one thought on his mind, turning over and over in his brain, pounding through his chest like a heartbeat. They'd found the person who'd sent the box. He could finally start on finding a cure. Istvay might live. He hadn't realized, until just now, how much the constant worry for Istvay had weighed down his every damn thought for the last, well, too many years to count. Even before they'd started showing signs, he'd worried, because Istvay was his whole world. How could he not worry? The raiders left them, and Istvay dropped wearily down onto a thick pile of blankets. They looked exhausted, but they glanced up at Aaand with concern. "Are you all right?" they asked softly. Aaand dropped down beside them. "I'm fine," he said, although he could hear the tension in his own voice. "I'm fine, just—" He trailed off. Istvay smiled faintly. "I'll admit, this wasn't on my list of things that I was expecting to happen today." "I can't believe they made us their pets," Aaand grumbled, and this time Istvay did laugh. Something about the cheerful, carefree sound of it caught Aaand off guard, and he had to close his eyes for a moment to regain his composure. Finally, there was a chance that Istvay would live. They'd have a chance to be happy, and he'd have a chance to hear them laugh years in the future, not just a few short, precious, tragic more months. The relief that washed over him at the thought was almost enough to leave him shaky. The buzz of his wavelength up the nerves of his arm jolted him out of his thoughts, and for a moment he stared around stupidly, trying to figure out where it had come from. "Aaand? Istvay?" The voice through his earpiece was Josip's. You're alive?" he asked, hearing the incredulity in his own tone. "What the hell? Where are you calling from? Are you still with the Yibo?" Josip chuckled. "It's good to hear your voice. We weren't sure you'd made it out, to be honest. You're too far away to show on our sensors." He sighed. "And no, we're not with the Yibo. At least we are, but not with Kachik and his friends. Are you two all right?" Aaand stared blankly at Istvay. At last, he said into the wavelength, Yes, we're fine." "Good." There was clear relief in Josip's voice. "I tried to call Istvay as well, but I couldn't get through to them. But they're all right? Where are you? What are you doing?" Aaand glanced at Istvay and squeezed his palm screen, so Josip's voice would carry through the amplifiers loud enough that Istvay could hear. "Pishti, your wavelength!" Istvay clenched their fist around their own palm screen experimentally, then shook their head in disgust. Must have been damaged in the crash. The damn thing was already glitching, and that must have finally killed it. Said Aaand helplessly, turning back to his own wavelength. "Istvay's here. We're both here. We found the raiders, and they may have made us into their pets, I think, but it's fine. They're going to help us find the cure. So..." There was a long silence from the other end of the line. "I probably shouldn't ask, should I?" Josip said at last. He sighed. "Aaand, I hate to interrupt you when you're so close to your goal, but we have a problem." By the time Josip finished his explanation, Aaand and Istvay were staring at each other in horror, their exhaustion forgotten. "The Yibo plan to destroy the Joias System," Aaand repeated at last. "I'm afraid so," said Josip quietly. "Well, I don't think our news is much better on that front," said Istvay, their voice grim. "The raiders are waiting for the portal to open for the same reason. The captain we ran into took a liking to us for some reason and decided to keep us alive, but he doesn't have any qualms about killing humans. They're gathering the various raider crews to go through the portal and kill everyone, but I'm not sure what we can do to stop it if they're as close to reopening the portal as you say." "We've discovered where the mechanism that creates the portal is," said Josip in a soft tone. "If we can destroy it, the portal can't reopen. That's how we stop this." Aaand stared at the wavelength implant on his wrist. He was finally here. He finally had the cure for Istvay right in front of him. "We may not need your help. This may not even be a possibility, and if it is, I'll do everything I can to keep you out of it." Josip paused a moment, and Aaand could hear the reluctance in the man's voice. "I am sorry," he said at last. "I know how much saving Istvay means to you, but this could be the entire Joias System at stake." He sighed. "But we should know within 24 Colorita hours, give or take, whether we'll be able to do this at all, and whether we'll need your help. So, I just wanted to give you a chance to think about it." "Thank you," said Aaand numbly. He tapped his wavelength off and turned to glance at Istvay. They were watching him, and there was an expression on their face that he couldn't read. They noticed him watching them and managed a shaky smile. Aaand scooted closer to them, on the pile of blankets, and laid a hand on their arm. "Pishti," he said quietly. "We'll figure this out. I promise. Get some sleep, okay? I'll keep watch for a bit, just in case. Aaaaand, Istvay began, and Aaaaand could hear how their voice caught. He shook his head. Pishti, listen. I don't care what we have to do. We're going to figure this out. You're not dying, not while there's something I can do to stop it. Joias System be damned. Do you understand me? Aaaaand sighed. They might not even need us. Let's talk about this tomorrow, okay? Istvay swallowed, their eyes still fixed on his, and then, with an effort, they nodded. All right, they said quietly. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Pishti, Aaaaand said, turning them to face him, you're my best friend, and we're going to figure this out. They watched him for a moment, something unreadable in their expression. At last, they managed a faint smile. Yeah. They lay back, curling up on the pile of blankets, and Aaaaand watched them until their breathing evened out in sleep. Then he stood restlessly, pacing back and forth from the door to the far wall. Despite the exhaustion that tugged at every muscle in his body, he couldn't bring himself to sit down. He was going to bloody well save Istvay. He had to. Chapter 17. Savina. Reka looked up from their shared breakfast. The guards who'd brought it had been very respectful, keeping their eyes conspicuously averted from Savina and leaving the food tray at the door of the cell before backing away quickly. Savina had had to work to fight back a grin at that. She glanced up at Reka. Yes, sweetheart, she cooed. Reka's gaze darkened, but she didn't take the bait. If we want to delay Kachik, it will take more than just a fistfight in our cell. I know, said Savina at last, letting her smile drop. Besides, last time was mostly luck. We'll need something a lot bigger. Reka was watching her. You've thought of something, haven't you? Savina smiled. Come on now, I'm the stupid one. You're supposed to be the one with the plans. I can't bother my pretty little head about details. Reka narrowed her eyes and reached out as if to snatch the bowl of breakfast from Savina. Savina yanked it out of reach. Hey, it won't look convincing if your girlfriend is starving to death. She paused a moment. Fine, I do have an idea. Reka leaned back against the wall, watching her warily. Well, Kachik said he wanted to meet with you today, didn't he? Talk through the plan to deal with Kavako? Do you think you could convince him you need your girlfriend along for emotional support? Reka's eyes narrowed further. And if I did that? Savina fluttered her eyelashes. Well, then I'd be so proud of you, sweetheart. She ducked out of the way of the spoon Reka tossed with deadly accuracy. Hey! Reka smirked as Savina rubbed at her shoulder. Is that all you need from me? That's not the only thing. Savina tried to keep her voice light to hide the sullen murder in her tone. She lowered her voice to a husky whisper. I need you to hold me, Reka. She yelped and covered her head with her arms as Reka's empty bowl followed the spoon. Not like that, you idiot! Do you see the cameras? Whispered Reka, from where she was supporting the stack of rickety stools Savina perched on, right in the camera's blind spot. Can you get to them? Can you shut the hell up? Savina hissed back. If you think this is so easy, you could do it yourself. Reka made an amused sound, and Savina glanced down in surprise, almost losing her balance. Reka caught her easily, propping her back up. Easy there. Mind on the job, Savina. Savina glared at her. I have my mind on the job, just because... Then she noticed the twitch at the corner of Reka's mouth, the humor in her eyes. She scowled and turned back to her work. Damn Reka to hell. It didn't take her long to figure out the mechanism, but she stayed there for a few moments longer, just to make Reka wait. At last, she let herself carefully down. There, she said, dimpling. I know what I'd have to take out to disable them. I doubt the Yibo will see much on their screens when I'm through. Savina saw a small glint of approval on Reka's face before the woman caught herself. Savina smiled wider. You'll just need to distract them while I do it. Too bad you're not as pretty as me, but I'll bet if you took your clothes off, they would... Reka's expression turned dangerous, and Savina stepped back quickly. You can't hurt me, Reka. Sweetheart, you need me. She fluttered her eyelashes. Reka narrowed her eyes. Call me sweetheart again without the guards here to listen, and I'll pin you to the wall by your throat, sweetheart. That tone of voice shouldn't make Savina's stomach twist. It shouldn't, and it didn't. And Savina glared at Reka's back for a few moments. And she absolutely did not have to wait for a moment for her heart to stop pounding before she could sit back down in her corner. Damn, Reka. Reka, we've been asked to bring you to speak with Kachik. The guards were still very obviously not making eye contact with Savina, and Savina bit back a smirk. All right, said Reka. She stood, then turned to help Savina gently to her feet as well, and put an arm around her, pulling her close. Savina almost swore at the sudden giddy flutter in her stomach. What the actual hell was wrong with her? Kachik asked for you, specifically. Perhaps your girlfriend... Reka shot them an icy glare. You think I'm going to leave Savina here alone, after what happened last time? She's coming, or I'm not. The guards conferred for a moment, and at last the leader said reluctantly, All right, she can come this time, but she'll need to be quiet and not make trouble. Savina looked up at them with big eyes, then back at Reka, her lip trembling. Reka gave her a tiny grin, then swore, turning back to the guards. You're making her cry. If you think you can come over here and insult my girlfriend until she cries. I'm sorry, the guard said in a panicked voice, backing up quickly enough to trip over his own feet. I didn't mean, I just meant... He trailed off, swallowing hard. We should go, if the two of you, that is, are ready. Savina? Reka's voice was warm and solicitous. She hadn't actually realized Reka's voice could sound warm, but it did, deep and soft, like the smell of cedarwood and dark chocolate, the low sweetness of a note pulled from a cello string with a newly rosined bow. Savina? She shook herself from her reverie and smiled up at Reka in mock adoration. Of course, my love. I'll go wherever you go. She made sure Reka could see the mockery in her glance, and she was rewarded with the tiniest tightening around Reka's eyes, and she wasn't sure why the words left a sour taste in her mouth. Somewhat to Savina's disappointment, the guards kept a respectful distance, so neither she nor Reka had an excuse to kill anyone. When they reached the room where Kachik was waiting, the guards gestured them politely through. Reka, her arm still around Savina's waist, went, drawing Savina after her. Savina glanced quickly around the room as Reka fussed over her, offering her a seat and making sure she was comfortable, and tried to pick out the technology she was looking for. It was better than watching Reka anyway, and her feigned solicitude. Reka, said Kachik at last, when they were finally both settled. Thank you for coming. I have the assurances of Captain Matin that Kavako is backing him, but I'd like to go over those assurances with someone who's worked with Kavako before, in order to attempt to parse out any potential issues. Of course, said Reka, her face cold and emotionless once it was turned to Kachik. Savina shuddered just a little. Reka was bloody terrifying, and she should probably not forget it. As Kachik and Reka talked in low voices, bent over a holodisc, Savina studied the room more closely. For the look of things, she cast a few flirtatious glances at Reka, and was rewarded with a small tightening around the corners of Reka's mouth. She smiled to herself. There were cameras installed in the corners, as they'd expected, and there, what she'd been looking for. An alarm. She blinked innocently and stood, stretching. Reka glanced over at her. Savina? It's all right, darling. I just need to stretch my legs. Savina laughed guilelessly. I'm sorry, I'm not really able to follow everything you and that Yibo person are talking about. Reka nodded, smiling at her fondly, and Savina looked quickly away. She wandered along the edge of the room, keeping her eyes surreptitiously on the guards. At first, they stiffened, watching her warily, but as she meandered aimlessly, they slowly turned their attention back to the conversation between Reka and Kachik. Reka certainly looked like a greater threat, her lean body set with that whip-crack readiness, her expression cold and indifferent, the air of danger she wore like a second skin. And Savina, well, she'd spent her entire life working on looking harmless and innocent and earnest and just a little silly. When she was certain she'd lost their attention, she moved over to one of the cameras. After her practice earlier, it only took her a moment to pull out the wire that would disconnect it, then yank a tiny component free. She moved on to the next. She'd only have a few minutes at most between when she disabled the first camera and when someone realized what she'd done, but she was very good at moving quickly while looking lost and aimless. She had 4 of the cameras disabled before she caught sight of a guard listening intently to his communicator, a slight frown on his face. She looked up, as if suddenly noticing something, and walked quickly over to the alarm. Before any of the guards had time to do more than glance in her direction, she raised up on her tiptoes, studying the device, then yanked hard on the dangling chain. A harsh wail filled the room, the noise grating against her eardrums. But painful as it was, it seemed to affect the Yibo even more. Kachik jumped to his feet, glancing around quickly. When he caught sight of Savina, his face darkened and he said something to Reka. Reka's face went even colder than usual, but she strode quickly over to Savina. "Savina, are you all right?" Savina looked up at her, face frightened, and Reka led her gently out of the room after Kachik, who looked on the verge of spontaneously combusting. Outside, the groups of panicked Yibo were running down hallways, opening lifts. "This way!" One of the guards grunted in the Yibo language and hurried them down a corridor, down a lift, through another corridor, and finally outside into a rapidly filling courtyard. "What happened back there?" Kachik hissed, rounding on Savina. "What did you do?" I didn't," Savina stammered, tears welling in her eyes. I was trying to help." Trying to help by disabling the cameras and pulling the emergency alarm. Kachik's voice was rising in a mix of outrage and disbelief. "What exactly are you trying to do, Savina?" He turned to Reka. "I thought we had an agreement. What—" "I wasn't disabling the cameras," Savina wailed. "I was trying to help. There were these bits sticking out, and they looked messy, and I thought I'd clean them up. And then, when I was going over to look at the alarm to see if there was anything I could clean up there, the guard startled me, and I pulled it on accident." She burst into sobs and buried her face in Reka's shoulder. "I thought we had an agreement as well, and it did not involve terrorizing my girlfriend," Reka hissed. "They evacuated the entire building because they couldn't see through the cameras what had happened in the room," Kachik shouted. The alarms blared in the background, and the courtyard was filled with the overexcited chatter of far, far too many Yibo, and Savina smiled into Reka's shoulder. One extra day for Joska, at any rate. It was a long time before they were returned to their cells. Kachik had been fuming, but from what Savina could see, there was going to be no further negotiations with Captain Matten happening that day. Reka had stood stoically between Savina and the fury of both Kachik and a diplomat named, if she recalled correctly, Harok, and any number of guards, as Savina alternately cried and babbled nonsense in her own defense. Now, back in their cell with the door closed and locked behind them, Savina let the stupid, innocent look drop from her face and leaned against the wall of the cell, rubbing a hand wearily across her face. When she looked up, Reka was watching her with a small smile that, for once, looked almost genuine. "That was not bad, Savina," she said quietly. The words sparked a small, unexpected ache in Savina's chest, and she gritted her teeth. She didn't need this. She didn't need any of this. After a few moments, Reka dropped down to sit on the cot and gestured to a stool. Savina sat warily, watching Reka for any sign of a trick. "Oh, for the mystery's sake," said Reka with a sigh. "If we're going to work together, you're going to have to stop acting like you're terrified of me." "Maybe I am," said Savina, widening her eyes again. "You're so big and strong and scary, and I'm just a little Rim Mountain country girl." Reka snorted. "That's enough. There's no one watching. Stop wasting both our time." Savina smiled and batted her eyelashes. "It's not a waste of my time. You're so cute when you're angry." Reka's mouth twitched. Just a little. Savina pulled her gaze away quickly. "After what happened today, there's no way I'll get permission to bring you with me tomorrow," Reka said. But, she paused, based on how well you play stupid, Savina, I may have another idea. Savina gradually scooted her stool closer to the cot as they mapped out the plan. When she looked up, she realized suddenly that they were shoulder to shoulder, hunched over a diagram Reka had sketched out in wrinkles on the blanket. Reka hadn't noticed, her focus on the small map she'd molded skillfully from the fabric, her lean hands moving over the surface as she spoke. Savina pushed her chair back, feeling suddenly awkward. Reka wanted to kill her. Reka was the reason she was trapped here in the first place. She had to remember that. But somehow, she was finding it more difficult than she'd expected. Chapter 18. Alba. It was late that night when Joska stood from her position at the window and turned to the others. I think they're asleep, she whispered. If we're planning on getting out, this is going to be our best chance. It only took a few minutes for the small group of them to gather their things. Nicolau, Alba whispered, you were going to find a way to get us out of the hospital without being seen, correct? Nicolau cleared his throat. He said. Benny got them to leave a window open in our room when they came to check on us earlier this evening. It opens up on the back of the building, and I've been watching. It's a back alley, and no one goes that way. We shouldn't be seen if we climb down. And I couldn't get my hands on any rope, but I thought if we took the bedsheets and tied them together... Benny's face took on an expression of sudden interest. Like in the steamy Alien Nights audios? Joska turned her head aside, coughing into her hand. Alba glared at him. You want us to tie bedsheets together and climb down the wall? Nicolau flushed. I mean, they do it all the time in the audios. Inez stepped forward, her eyes flashing. It's a good idea, she said, unless any of you have a better one. Alba looked at the young interpreter in astonishment. No, it's not a bad idea, Joska said. Her voice was carefully neutral, but she was obviously biting back a smile. It'll certainly be better than trying to climb down hand over hand. It didn't take long to get the bedsheets gathered and torn into strips. Nicolau was surprisingly adept at the knots, and between him, Joska, and Rafael, they soon had a small, serviceable length of rope. Joska examined it critically, then nodded. I think it'll hold. Now, I'll go first, said Inez. There was determination behind her frightened expression. I'm the lightest. I can test it to make sure it'll hold. Nicolau looked at her in concern. Inez, you don't have to... She lifted her chin and looked him directly in the eye. I trust you, she said quietly. Even in the dark, Alba could see Nicolau flush. Well, anyway, I'll secure the rope, but I'll be holding it too, just in case, he said, his voice rough. Joska was no longer even attempting to hide her amusement, but thankfully the two young people were entirely focused on each other and seemed not to have a thought to spare for their elders. With Nicolau bracing himself to secure it against one of the cot frames, Inez grabbed the makeshift rope. Her eyes were wide in the moonlight through the open window, her expression that same sick determination Alba had seen there so many times. Inez, Alba said quietly. Inez jerked her head up, startled. Good luck. Inez gave a nervous little bob of her head. Then she took a tighter grip on the rope and let herself carefully down off the side of the wall. The rest of them watched as she lowered herself slowly to the ground, but she reached it without incident. She untangled herself from the rope, shook it loose, then stood back, nodding up at them. Nicolau let out an audible sigh of relief and turned back to the others. All right, it looks like it's safe. Who's next? Joska went down next, then Benny, and then between the three on the ground and Nicolau on the wall, they lowered Josip, Feliu, and the still injured Rafael, despite his grumbling protestations that he was perfectly fine and didn't need help. When it was Alba's turn, she had to swallow hard against the vertigo as she looked down at the drop below her. But both Feliu and Josip had gone, and she couldn't bring herself to show hesitation where they hadn't. So she closed her eyes and seated herself in the uncomfortable makeshift harness Nicolau had improvised, holding back a gasp as she was lowered gently over the window ledge. The wind jostled the thin rope, bumping her against the wall of the building painfully more than once before she reached the bottom, and by the time her feet touched something solid, she felt like a pig that had been twisting on a spit. She closed her eyes in relief as the harness settled her back on solid ground. Then Josip and Joska were there, unstrapping her from the harness and helping her out. Her legs were shaky enough from the trip that she was grateful for Joska's firm grip on her arm, steadying her. "Easy there, Chief Justice," Joska murmured, but she stayed until Alba's legs steadied under her and she could move stiffly over to stand with the others. Nicolau followed last, untying the rope and looping it around the legs of the cot he'd dragged up against the window, then wrapping both ends of the rope around himself and abseiling down with practiced ease. When he reached the ground, he loosened the rope from around himself and pulled one end up and over until the whole thing lay in a pile at his feet. He coiled it quickly and stowed it in his knapsack, then looked up with a grin. "I knew it was a good idea," said Inez, coming over to stand beside him. He looked down at her, his face flushing again in the moonlight, but his smile was wide and genuine. "All right, now all that's left is getting out of here before the Yibo notice we're missing," said Joska. The group of them stepped cautiously out into the dark, silent streets. The village was quiet, and it didn't appear that their escape had been noted. As long as they kept to the shadows, no one seemed concerned with finding them out. Although Alba was more than certain the guards would be very interested indeed in finding them out should they realize what she and the rest of her motley group were planning to do. The breeze off the dry grasslands carried a sharp, fresh, musky smell. Beside Alba, Felia was muttering under his breath. "Are you all right?" she whispered. He glared at her. "Madam, with all due respect, considering what we've been through in the last few weeks, I hardly think that's a question that deserves an honest answer." Alba bit back a small smile despite herself. By the time they reached the edge of the village, Alba's knee was already stiff. Felia was still grumbling, and from behind them, Alba could hear Rafael muttering swear words under his breath. Felia cast the occasional irritated glance back at the crewman, but honestly, the tone of Rafael's swearing was so similar to the tone of Felia's grumbling that Alba had to hold back a chuckle. At the last street before the force field, they came to a halt. "Well done," said Joska quietly. "Now we just have to get past the guards." "Let me take care of the guards," Josip whispered. "They know me, and I was meaning to ask one of them for their porridge soup recipe anyway, so I don't think anyone will think it's too strange." Alba refrained with an effort from commenting, but she could see the twitch of amusement in Joska's face. "No," the woman said, with an obvious effort to keep her voice solemn. "I don't expect they would." "All right," said Josip, stepping out of the alley. "The rest of you go while I'm talking. I'll join you in a minute." They watched as he strolled up to the two guards on duty. She couldn't hear the conversation from this distance, but Alba saw the tension in the guards' movements as they spun at the sound, and its sudden release when they caught sight of Josip. It wasn't long before he and the guards were leaned back against the wall of one of the buildings, postures relaxed, clearly shooting the breeze. One of the guards laughed at something Josip said, and Alba could picture the twinkle in Josip's eyes. "Come on," Joska whispered, and the small group of them crept silently out of the alley. When they reached the force field, they ducked behind a building, out of sight of the guards. "Josip," Joska whispered into her wavelength. "We're here. We just need an opening to get through." It was several endless minutes before they heard soft footsteps. Josip rounded the corner, and as he did so, an opening appeared in the force field. As Alba had predicted, his eyes were bright with good humor, and his smile was wide and infectious. He glanced behind him, then beckoned the rest of them through. "Apparently, Ida's son should be glad that she hasn't told his new boyfriend exactly what she thinks of him," he whispered as they joined him. Joska caught Alba's eye, and they shared an amused glance. "I told them I wanted to look at the stars, and they said that should be fine as long as I'm careful and stay close." "Well, best take advantage of it," said Joska. Alba sighed inwardly. Her body ached and her knee ached, and if she stopped to think of it, there didn't seem to be a single part of her that didn't ache. But Joska was right. Best go while they had the chance. "Lead the way," she said. At least, Alba thought, as she forced her exhausted body to keep moving. This escape attempt, they weren't being pursued by raiders. At least there was that. It was hard to hold on to any sort of positive thought, though, with every muscle in her body aching and her knee burning with pain. "Are you all right?" She turned to see that Josip had come up beside her. He looked as tired as she felt, but somehow his face was still creased in a wan smile. "I suspect you know the answer to that as well as I do," she said wryly. He chuckled, and they walked for a while in companionable silence. "Josip," she asked at last, Do you think we have a chance at this?" She wasn't sure what had prompted the question. Maybe just something to keep her mind off the never-ending torment of walking. Josip smiled, the expression unaccountably reassuring. "If you'd asked me a few months ago if we'd have a chance of surviving a mutiny, a ship breakup, being stranded on an alien planet, captured in an alien city, and almost eaten alive by raiders, I'm not sure how I would have answered you. But here we are." She returned his smile. "I suppose you're right. Here we are." By the time they reached the Dolphin, neither she nor Josip had energy to spare for conversation. They staggered into the ship, and Alba almost fell onto one of the cots. "Well," said Joska quietly, "we made it." She glanced around. "I didn't see any signs of pursuit, so I think we have time. I suggest we contact Aaaaand again. I don't know what we're going to find out there, but I doubt we'll have even a chance without his and Istvay's help." Alba nodded, almost too weary to answer. "I'll talk to him," said Josip quietly. "I don't think he's going to be happy about this, but perhaps I can convince him." Alba glanced up. "It's the entire Joias System," she snapped. "I should certainly hope he can be convinced." "It's his friend's life," said Josip softly, meeting her gaze. "But I'll do what I can." Alba frowned, watching him as he tapped in the code on his wavelength. And it struck her once again how very little it appeared that she understood the people in the system she was supposed to have been governing all these years. Chapter 19. Aaaaand. Aaaaand woke late the next morning, his entire body stiff and aching, and a dull pang of hunger gnawing at his stomach. He rolled over to find Istvay sprawled out across the blankets next to him, still fast asleep. He smiled a little, watching them, then rolled carefully up to a sitting position. Ani chirruped questioningly from a nest of blankets beside him, and he reached over to rub her head. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered. "Sleep well?" She sidled closer, purring, her bulbous eyes watching him pleadingly, and he grinned, shaking his head at her. "Come on then, let's see if we can find something for you to eat." He tucked the blankets up around Istvay gently, and they stirred, but didn't wake as Aaaaand pushed himself carefully to his feet. Someone had left a plate of food outside the door to his and Istvay's cabin, an assortment of foods that Aaaaand couldn't readily identify. 3 cuts of meat, 1 raw, 1 medium rare, and 1 cooked to approximately the consistency of charcoal, along with a variety of other fruits and vegetables, most of them split neatly into cooked, raw, and charcoaled lumps. He bit back a small grin. He was willing to bet the scientist had provided this particular tray. He pulled out his scanner and did a basic scan of the fruits and vegetables. At least 3 of them seemed edible, and they could almost certainly eat the meat. The scientist had said he and Istvay were the first humans she'd seen, so he wouldn't be committing cannibalism at the very least. He tasted a couple of the items, and if they tasted halfway palatable, he set them aside for Istvay. Ani helped herself to anything he didn't eat. Although she didn't touch the burnt food, that was apparently too much even for her. When he glanced back, Istvay had opened their eyes and was watching him. Aaaaand managed a small smile and came over to sit next to them. "Here, none of these should kill you," he said, pushing the tray over to them. Istvay sat up, then groaned, "Hell, I feel like someone ran into me with a damn transport." Aaaaand grinned. "Well, I mean, you crashed an escape pod into a forest, then spent the next 3 days running for your life, so..." Istvay groaned again and picked up one of the pieces of fruit. Don't remind me, please. I'm doing my best to wipe the last 3 days from my memory. Aaaaand laughed, trying not to think of his conversation with Josip the previous evening. It would be fine. The others probably wouldn't need him in Istvay after all. Istvay shook their head, chuckling reluctantly, and took another piece of fruit. A loud pounding at the door made Aaaaand jump. The door swung open before either he or Istvay had time to react, and the raider captain stepped in, grinning broadly. Aaaaand! Istvay! Ani! Slept well, I hope? Yes, Aaaaand began. Good, good! The raider captain was grinning even broader now, his sharp canines glittering in the artificial light. Come, let me show you around before I take you over to our scientist friend. I'd hate for you to go somewhere you shouldn't and be killed. Desi would never forgive me. Aaaaand and Istvay exchanged glances. Istvay gave a small shrug, and the two of them stood and followed the captain, Ani, scrambling onto her accustomed place on Aaaaand's shoulder. And this, here, is our cockpit. I understand you humans travel in space as well? Yes, said Aaaaand warily. Good, good. We'll make sure we take you out with us on trips. And over here is where the crew bunks. Their places are sorted out by how many kills they have. A raider kill counts twice as much as a Yibo kill and 3 times as much as a human. He glanced over at them quickly and added in a placating tone, but don't feel bad. I may have to revise humans to the same level as a Yibo after meeting the 3 of you. Aaaaand had to bite back a laugh at the look on Istvay's face. What are those? Asked Istvay, gesturing. The captain glanced over. Ah, these are the key chips to the attack pods. The pods are in a clearing closer to the foot of the mountain. I leave my ship there, usually, but I wanted to come say hello to Desi. But don't touch them. I don't want you leaving the clearing without my permission. As I said, Desi would be so angry if I killed you. You've known Desi for a long time, then? Said Aaaaand warily. The captain roared with laughter and slapped him on the shoulder. Aaaaand flinched back at the unexpected touch, and Ani growled. The captain laughed. Now, I thought you were brave. Best get used to... He reached out to slap Aaaaand on the shoulder again, and Aaaaand grabbed for Ani and hunched his shoulders, bracing himself. Istvay stepped forward quickly, catching the captain's wrist. Don't touch him unless you ask him first, they said, something steely in their voice. The captain blinked at Istvay in utter bewilderment. Then his face darkened. How dare you grab my arm? I'm the captain here, Aaaaand glanced quickly between the captain and Istvay and took a firm grip on Ani, ready to jump between his friend and the captain. From the look on Istvay's face, Aaaaand wasn't completely sure which of them he'd be protecting from the other. Istvay took a deep breath. Please don't touch him unless you ask first then, they said, sounding like they were forcing out the words. It causes him a great deal of stress. I didn't want you to inadvertently harm him and upset Desi. The captain stared at Istvay for a moment. Then he chuckled, and Aaaaand's shoulders dropped in relief. You're right. Best not to upset Desi. I'm very sorry then, Istvay, he said, good humor seemingly restored. I had no intention of harming your Aaaaand. Aaaaand's heart jumped a little at your Aaaaand, but he forced his expression neutral. I'll tell the crew then, if that's the case, Kravai continued. We want to make sure we treat our humans with nothing but respect. He turned back to Istvay. Anything else I should know? It's really not that important, Aaaaand began, but Istvay shot him a glare. He doesn't like loud noises, and he doesn't like crowds, and he doesn't like being touched without permission, said Istvay. And he doesn't like space travel. Ah, that is very good information, said the captain, eyebrows creasing into a small frown. I'll make a note of it. He reached into a pocket and pulled out a tablet, tapped it, and began writing something with the tip of his finger. Aaaaand stared at Istvay and then at the captain in frank astonishment. Istvay looked just as nonplussed as he felt. The captain finished his note, tucked the tablet back into his pocket, then beamed at the two of them. I'll ensure the crew knows this, and if they don't respect you, you have my permission to set your Ani on them. began Aaand in alarm. "It's really not that big of a—" The captain had already started off again. "Captain," said Istvay at last, as the captain led them through the ship with what seemed like utter delight. "This portal, Desi said something about you going through it and killing humans on the other side." The captain turned in surprise, pausing mid-sentence. "Yes," he said at last. "That's the plan. Captain Sharda took the portal down because she wanted to give us a chance to get through before the Yibo, or at least not too long after. The last time they opened a portal through to a human settlement, it was only those of us who were in range and happened to see it who were able to go through." He shrugged. "It wasn't fruitless. I'd say we took a few 100,000 humans, but it certainly wasn't what it could have been, so this time when we saw the portal opening, Sharda took it down to give herself time to spread the word to the rest of the raider ships. This way, we can all go in when they're ready to reopen it." He gestured around. "We raiders generally live on our ships as crews, as Desi told you. But this moon here is where we come when we need to be planetside for a while to pick up supplies or find mates or whatever. There are cities here, and we all make it back here eventually. She knew that. Given enough time, we could ensure that most of the raider ships knew and were waiting." Aaand blinked, the horror of what Krivai had just said sinking in. "You," he began at last, his voice shaky. "You killed that many humans?" He felt sick to his stomach. The captain shrugged. "It's not like we didn't treat them well. The Yibo destroyed their planet and kept the survivors caged up. We let them run free and just took the ones we were going to use. If we lay first claim to the planet, the Yibo won't dare, so really it's better for everyone." But you kill—" Krivai frowned. "I didn't realize you'd find it so disturbing. Surely humans kill each other too. And besides, sometimes there are humans we take a liking to and they sign on with our crew, just like you're doing. Desi even claims we have some human DNA, so we're a little related." Aaand took a deep breath, trying to push back the horror. "Captain," he said quietly, "what would it take to convince you not to do that?" There was a long moment of silence. The raider captain studied him, still frowning. "Not," he began, as if not entirely sure what Aaand was asking. "Not go through the portal. Close down the mechanism again. Not wipe out the humans. Surely there's something you want. Something we could offer you." The captain was still frowning. Do you have family back there?" "Not family, no," said Istvay grimly. "But friends, people we care about. And we'd just as soon not see them hunted for food." The captain's face cleared. "Ah, is that all?" He paused, then took a breath, as if preparing himself to offer something priceless. "Istvay, Aaand, I like you two, and you're part of my crew. So, if you have specific humans you'd like us not to kill, tell me their names and I'll do my best to arrange for something. And you don't need to worry about yourselves. You have friends here now." He gestured expansively around the ship. "Every one of my crew would put themselves in the way of a shot for you. Or if they wouldn't, they know they'll be facing a shot from me." He laughed. "Besides, it's not like there aren't other colonies of humans, so you're not an endangered species or anything, whatever Desi and her little theories say. So no need to worry. You give me a list of your friends and we'll figure out a way to identify them." He strode off, and Aaand and Istvay had no choice but to follow. They glanced at each other, and Aaand could see the horror in Istvay's face, but the captain was clearly not open to further conversation on the subject. "And here we are at last," said Krivai, ducking out the hatch of the ship. "You've eaten this morning, yes? Good. I promised Desi I'd hand you over to her the moment I finished our tour." Aaand's protest died on his lips, a quick jolt of hope starting in his chest. From the corner of his eye, he could see the sudden tension in Istvay's expression. He swallowed hard. He couldn't even tally how long his fear for Istvay had been tickling at the back of his brain, never quite letting him relax. Almost as long as he could remember, probably since he'd seen Istvay's mother die. The genetics of the defect weren't that straightforward, and he'd known that the fact Istvay's mother had it didn't necessarily mean Istvay would as well. But the fear had started back then, the terror of what if. And then, around 3 years ago, that niggling fear had bloomed into full-on panic as the first signs of the illness took hold. Istvay had never spoken about it much. Istvay had always been stoic and matter-of-fact about their condition, about the fact they were going to die, and there was nothing either they or Aaaaand could do about it. But looking at his friend now, Aaaaand knew suddenly that it had all been nothing but an act. Neither of them spoke as the captain escorted them to the small research station. He pounded on the door, then shoved it open. "Desi!" he bellowed, then, noticing Aaaaand's unconscious wince at the noise, clapped a hand over his mouth with an expression of alarm that was almost comical. "Desi!" he tried again, this time in a hissed, exaggerated whisper. Aaaaand gave Istvay a rueful glance. Desi appeared through a small door in the back of the research station and hurried over. She reached out to grab Istvay by the arm, but the captain stepped quickly in front of them. "No," he said firmly. "Humans don't like being touched without permission. You have to ask first." It's not," Istvay began. Desi raised her eyebrows in interest. "My studies didn't mention this. Interesting. Is there anything else I should know?" "I have a list of some of their human preferences," the captain said, a trace of smugness in his voice. "I'll send it to your datapad." Desi looked mildly annoyed, but she nodded. "I'd be grateful," she said stiffly. "And I, of course, will send you the results of my studies on their eating and sleeping preferences." The captain didn't look annoyed in the slightest, just grinned broadly. "Good, good," he said, ducking back out the door with a cheery wave. "I'll leave the 3 of you to it then. 4 of you, sorry, Ani." Once he was gone, the 3 of them stared at each other. We're his pets, aren't we?" said Istvay. Desi sighed heavily. "Yes," she said. There was a hint of exasperation in her tone. "I spent hours last night trying to explain that you were sapient species and that you deserved to be treated with autonomy, and he just grinned and promised of course you would. He wouldn't dream of doing otherwise, but yes, you're his pets. He tried to bring back a Charek once, and we only convinced him to get rid of it when it had mind-melded with half the crew and forced a mutiny." She shuddered. "A Charek?" asked Istvay, resigned dread in their tone. "What are—" They shot a quick glance at Aaaaand and shook their head grimly. "Actually, forget I asked. The less we know about any deadly species that live in this place, the better, probably." Desi blew out a breath. "They live in very deep space, so I doubt you'll run into them." She shuddered again. "Which is lucky for you. Anyone who doesn't manage to run into them is lucky. Now then." She stepped back, her gaze running over Aaaaand and Istvay. "Which one of you is the sick one? I'm not sure, because I've never been able to study live human physiology, but I'm assuming the pale skinny one?" Aaaaand bit down hard on his grin, and Istvay scowled. "Good," she said brightly. "Then I think the first thing we want to do is draw some blood. I spent last night thinking up a few different tests we could do to figure out the cause of this, but I think this is our first step. First, though, I'll need each of you to step into the isolation chamber for measurements. Ani too, if she'd like, but I'm mostly interested in you two. I'd like to do some base metabolic measurements on a healthy human specimen and an unhealthy one. Oxygen intake, CO2 output, basic caloric output, so forth." Istvay narrowed their eyes. "The captain sees us as pets," they said flatly. "But you just see us as sapient data mines." "No, of course not. Whatever gives you that idea?" Desi sounded slightly uncomfortable, and she turned away quickly without meeting their eye. Istvay muttered a curse under their breath. Aaaaand, though, couldn't possibly have cared less. If they could find a cure for Istvay, he'd be a sapient data mine for as long as Desi wanted. In the end, Aaaaand persuaded Ani to wait in their cabin after procuring her some food, but once he got back, the baseline observations Desi insisted on took the rest of the morning. Aaaaand was practically dancing with impatience by the time she beckoned them both through the small door in the back of the research station and into her lab. She gestured Istvay to a stool. Then she pulled out a small vial with a sharp needle on one end. She studied Istvay for a moment, her face registering uncertainty, and Aaaaand sighed and stepped forward, kneeling beside his friend. "This is the easiest way to take blood, generally," he said, taking Istvay's wrist and turning their hand palm up. He glanced at them for permission, then pulled back their shirt sleeve, running his fingers up their forearm to rest on the blue vein at the inside of their elbow. Istvay shivered, and he glanced up at them in concern. "It's chilly in here," said Istvay, scowling. Aaaaand stood quickly, shrugging out of his jacket, and draped it over his friend's shoulders. "Better?" he whispered, and Istvay gave a grumpy nod. Aaaaand knelt beside them again, repositioning his hand, and turned back to Desi, his fingers resting lightly on the inside of Istvay's elbow. He wasn't sure whether or not the room was actually cold. The adrenaline pumping through his veins was enough to make a thin sheen of sweat form under his hair. "May I?" he asked. Desi hesitated, then handed him the vial, coming closer to hover over his shoulder, eyes wide with curiosity. "Vacuum sealed?" he asked. She nodded. "It's made for raiders. I don't know how much blood you humans can spare before it affects you, so you'll have to pull it out once we have enough for an analysis." Aaaaand nodded. "Okay, Pishti, it'll be just a poke," he mumbled, and with a quick, precise motion, he tapped the small needle into Istvay's vein. "Clench your fist," he said out of habit, but it was hardly necessary. Bright red blood sprayed out in a thin stream, coating the inside of the cylinder and dripping down the sides. Aaaaand waited a couple seconds, then pulled it out with a quick jerk, pressing his finger over the puncture wound to stop the bleeding. He handed the vial to Desi with his free hand, and she took it, turning to her equipment. "Let me run a quick DNA analysis," she muttered as she worked. "I had the captain give me a fresh blood sample yesterday as well. I thought having a more recent sample to analyze might be helpful." She turned back to Aaaaand as the machine behind her hummed quietly. "Can you pull up the analysis you did back on your planet and show me where this defect is located on a human genome map?" Aaaaand nodded. Carefully, he lifted his pressed fingers from Istvay's arm, checking to make sure the bleeding had stopped. They were watching him, their eyes dark, jaw clenched as if they were in pain, but they shook their heads shortly when he gave them a questioning look. Aaaaand closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. Then he tapped his palm screen open, paging through to the readout from back on Colorida. "I assume your DNA analysis machines are similar to the ones the Yibo use?" he asked, his voice shaking. His heart was pounding far too quickly. What if he'd been wrong? What if there was no defect to be found in the captain's new blood sample, and it had only been the effects of the faster-than-light travel that had sent the box through to their planet? "Broadly similar, yes," said Desi, not seeming to notice his nerves. "The readouts will be more or less the same if that's what you're worried about." Aaaaand nodded. "Our readouts are completely different, but I put together a key between the Yibo readouts and ours, so I should be able to—" He trailed off in concentration, squinting down at the readout Desi placed in front of him, comparing it to the painstaking map he'd made from the Yibo readout back in the city. At last he grinned, letting out a long breath. "There. That's it. Right there." He expanded the screen and tapped the place. Desi frowned down at the section Aaaaand had indicated on the readout, then nodded slowly. "I see it," she said. "That's not really uncommon in our population. It's a mild genetic abnormality. We've never really tracked it because it doesn't seem to have any measurable effect on health, but I'd say at a guess it's present in 10 to 15% of the population." Behind her, the machine beeped and she turned. She crossed over to it, tapped her datapad to the screen, and brought it over, placing it on the small lab table. "All right," she said, leaning over it beside Aaaaand. "This is your friend's readout." She glanced at him. "You don't have this genetic abnormality, do you?" Aaaaand shook his head. "Good. I'll take a sample from you as well then, so we've got a control. We'll see if we can determine why this is deadly to humans and not to raiders. That should at least give us a starting point." Istvay had stood up from the stool and was leaning against the doorframe, hands in their pockets. Their head was tipped back, and they were staring blankly at a point where the wall of the lab met the ceiling. Aaaaand could read the tension in every line of their posture. Normally, they'd be peering over his shoulder, or more likely, they'd be the one talking excitedly about the results with Desi. They'd always been more interested in the laboratory analysis aspect of things than Aaaaand had. "Pishti," Aaaaand asked quietly, Once he'd handed the raider scientist the vial half full of his own blood, and she'd turned back to the machine. "Why don't you go outside for a bit, look around? It wouldn't hurt for us to have a sense of where we are." Istvay turned to glare at him. "I know what you're doing, Aaaaand. I don't need to be babied." Aaaaand grinned a little. "Okay, fine, but it wouldn't hurt to get our bearings either way." He paused. "Besides, you're making me so nervous that I had to try 3 times to get the vein when I was giving my blood sample, and now I'm going to have a bruise." Istvay narrowed their eyes at him, then sighed. "I suppose you're right," they said at last, ruefully. "Fine, I'll go." Aaaaand put a hand on their shoulder and gave them a reassuring squeeze. "Pishti," he said in a low voice. "I promise. I'll do everything I can do. Everything." Istvay studied him for a few moments, their eyes unreadable. At last they reached up, putting their hand over Aaaaand's. "I know you will," they said quietly. Then they turned and stepped out the door. Aaaaand looked after them for a long moment. Finally, he turned back to the lab table, bending over the data sheets again. His stomach was tight, every muscle in his body tense. This might be his only chance. He wasn't naive enough to think they'd simply stumble across a cure the first time they took the time to look. But if Josip called again tonight, he had to at least have gotten far enough to know what data he'd need to take with him when they left. "All right," said Desi, coming over with the new readout. "Do you have a genome map accessible? Let's get started comparing the human map with the raiders." Aaaaand had no idea how long it had been when he went to pull up and merge the next batch in the endless sequence prepared by the program, and realized he'd reached the end of the list. He stared blankly down at the long line of notes on his palm screen until Desi crossed over to him in concern. "Aaaaand?" she asked. "Is there something wrong?" He shook his head, still in a daze, a comparative map of the raider and human genome. If there was a key to saving Istvay, he was holding it right now in his battered palm screen. "Are you sure you're all right, Aaaaand?" Desi's voice seemed to come from a long way away. He blinked, reaching out to steady himself on the table. "Yes," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Yes, I'm fine." A faint nausea churned in his stomach, and he felt lightheaded, his legs almost too unsteady to hold him. "Well, I think that's enough for today anyway," said Desi briskly. "We can't really do anything further until I feed your data into the machine, and we can do a clean analysis on the samples." She paused. "Are you in pain? What's the matter?" Aaaaand chuckled weakly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "No, I'm fine. It's just... I just didn't think... I never thought I'd be able to..." He found he couldn't continue. Desi pulled out her datapad and jotted something down, probably a note about human habits around crying. He honestly couldn't care less. I'm going to tell Istvay how far we got," he said, and turned quickly to the door. Wait, are you hungry? I've put together some samples based off your selections this morning." Her voice faded behind him as he half jogged out of the lab and into the open clearing. The clearing was large, but he knew Istvay well enough that it didn't take him long to track them down. They were seated at the base of an old tree just outside the clearing, leaned up against the trunk where the tangled roots made a small hollow. Their head jerked up at his approach, but they didn't turn, just sat where they were, staring straight ahead. They were twisting a small twig absently between their fingers, their jaw clenched tight. Aaaaand came over without speaking and dropped down beside them. He leaned back against the tree, and for a while the two of them sat in silence. At last, Aaaaand reached out and caught the twig Istvay was twisting. Their hands stilled, but they didn't turn. "Pishti," he said. And then he found he couldn't speak at all, his throat too tight, tears stinging at his eyes, his chest constricting so he could hardly breathe. Istvay turned quickly, the tension in their face overlaid with sudden concern. "Aaaaand," they said, "listen, it's fine. I never expected that we'd be able to... Look, it's fine if we can't..." They shifted to face him, putting their hands on his shoulders like they always did when they were trying to reassure him. Aaaaand shook his head, managing a trembling smile. "Pishti, no," he choked. "That's not it. Desi had the information we needed, and we were able to compile a comparative genome map." We can feed her blood and mine in for controls, and we should be able to... I think we'll be able to... Pishti, I never thought we'd be this close. I never thought... He broke off, unable to say any more. Istvay had stilled, their face gone bloodless. They turned away quickly, dropping their face into their hands. Aaaaand, Pishti, he whispered. Pishti, I think we're going to be able to figure this out. By the time Desi tracked the two of them down, carrying a tray of food, Istvay had brought themselves under control again. Their face was still ghastly pale, but they managed a smile of thanks as they took the food. Desi, it appeared, had decided to further her research by sitting and watching them eat while she took notes, and after the hours she'd spent in the lab with him, Aaaaand could hardly bring himself to complain. So, with a rueful glance at each other, Aaaaand and Istvay ate in silence. "All right," she said when they'd finished. "I'm going to let some more analyses run overnight, and tomorrow morning we can get to work again. In the meantime, you can wander around if you'd like, or you can get some rest. I told the captain to leave you alone." Istvay still wasn't speaking by the time they and Aaaaand got back to their room on the ship. They looked like they were in shock. "Pishti?" asked Aaaaand cautiously. "Pishti, listen." Istvay took a deep breath and attempted a smile, although their face was still very, very pale. "Sorry," they said. I'm fine, I promise, just..." They squeezed their eyes closed, blinking back tears. Aaaaand came over to sit beside them, putting an arm around their shoulders. "Pishti," he said quietly. And Istvay leaned against him and dropped their head into their hands again and cried. The lights had gone out on the ship, and the restless exhilaration from the day's efforts was starting to fade from Aaaaand's tight muscles enough for him to think about lying down, when there was a buzz through his wavelength. He glanced down at it, his stomach tightening suddenly in worry rather than excitement. "Josip?" he whispered, tapping his wrist to activate it. "Aaaaand." Josip paused a moment. I'm very sorry, but it looks like there's no way we can do this without the two of you." Chapter 20. Savina. When they heard the footsteps of the guards approaching the next afternoon, Reka turned to glance at Savina, who was stretched out on the cot. "Be careful," she said in a low voice. "Kachik is more dangerous than he looks." Savina smiled lazily up at her. "Reka, worried about me? So you do like me after all?" Reka smirked, reaching into the pocket of her suit and pulling out a small electronic device. "In your dreams. Here, I stole this off one of the soldiers I killed." She tossed it at Savina. "It should let you pick the lock and open a doorway, but I can't promise anything." Savina almost didn't see the device, too distracted by the mesmerizing grace of Reka's movements, and barely snatched it out of the air before it hit the ground. She scowled. It wasn't fair of Reka to be this attractive. If she'd been bad at what she did, it would have been one thing, but it simply wasn't fair that she was this good at everything and this stupidly hot at the same time. "Savina?" She blinked out of her reverie. Reka was watching her, a dry smile on her lips. Damn it. Why was she looking at Reka's lips? Savina looked up at her, pouting prettily. "I don't know why you're so mean to me all the time." "Because you're a thief and a murderer without a single redeeming quality?" said Reka dryly. "Focus on the job, Savina." Savina narrowed her eyes and gave Reka a sweet smile. "I'm always focused, sweetheart." The glance Reka shot her was more amused than furious. Savina closed her eyes and refused to think about the way that small, barely there grin made something tighten pleasantly in the pit of her stomach. The guards arrived a few moments later, and Savina let her breathing go slow and soft. "Shh. She's asleep," Reka whispered as the guards pushed the door open, gesturing towards Savina. "She was upset after what happened yesterday, so I told her to take some time to recover." Her tone was so concerned that Savina almost frowned. There was clearly someone, somewhere, that Reka cared about deeply, for this concern to come so naturally to her. And Savina realized, yet again, that she knew next to nothing about Reka Soler. Reka slipped out the door after the guards, and Savina waited until she couldn't hear footsteps in the corridor any longer. Then she sat up and made her way over to the door. She listened at it for a few moments, then carefully picked the lock. It was more complicated than Reka had made it look, and she was swearing steadily under her breath by the time the cell door swung gently open. She pulled up the map of the building that Reka had sent through on her wavelink and studied it for a moment, then stepped out into the hallway. She crept down the corridors, always keeping near the wall so she could slip into a cross hallway if necessary. The hallways were all but empty, which probably meant the Yibo bureaucrats were busy doing whatever they did in their meeting rooms. Savina had never had much time for politics, besides learning the names and likely locations of whoever she'd been hired to kill. It took her almost half an hour to get to the room she and Reka had identified the night before. When she reached it, she ducked behind a decorative plant, breathing heavily. 6 flights of stairs were more than anyone should be expected to climb for any reason. Her muscles were tense with a mix of anticipation and terror. Why had she agreed to this again? She was having a hard time remembering. Because her kidnapping victim had asked nicely? Because she was trying to prove something to a woman who wanted to kill her? For half a second, she heard Joska's measured voice through her earpiece, the concern in it, the confidence, probably unmerited, that Savina could handle whatever she got herself into. Damn it to hell! Savina closed her eyes, steeling herself. Then she straightened, stepped briskly out of her hiding place, and strode towards the conference room door. The guards turned in surprise at her approach, raising their weapons, and Savina batted her eyelashes at them. "I'm so sorry. I'm lost, and I don't know where I'm going. Can you—" One of the guards heaved a sigh of exasperation and started towards her, lowering his weapon and beckoning to his companion. She stood still, waiting as they approached, a look of confusion on her face. And then, as the first guard grabbed her arm, she reached down, snatched the gun from his other hand, and shot him in the face. He disintegrated at the weapon fire. His companion let out a shout of alarm, and Savina whirled and shot her as well. She could hear footsteps in the hallway, a reaction to the guard's shout. She smiled grimly to herself and stepped up to the conference room door, pulled out the electronic device Reka had loaned her, and slid it across the glass. The glass melted. She stepped through the opening, holding the gun with both hands. She kept a look of frightened bewilderment on her face, and as one of the Yibo politicians stood, she turned the weapon, firing at the column beside them. The column melted. The politician screamed, and Savina let out a startled shriek, dropping the weapon. She raised her hands, babbling something meaningless. Her heart was pounding. She hated being helpless. She was used to looking the part and act to lure her marks into complacency, but actually being trapped, wholly dependent on her captor's mercy, was a sick, ugly feeling. She forced herself to stay still, not to dive for the gun she'd dropped. 2 Yibo guards grabbed her roughly, shoving her to the floor, and she whimpered, tears welling in her eyes. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was just trying to find my girlfriend." Had she come to the right place? Reka had told her she'd be in a room on this same hallway, but how the hell would Reka know that? It would have been a guess at best, and damn it, Savina knew better than to trust someone who wanted to kill her. The guards pulled her hands behind her back and secured them tightly, then yanked her to her feet. Tears were rolling down her cheeks, her eyes wide and frightened. "Please, I'm so sorry. I really didn't mean—" There was a shout from outside. Apparently someone had found the 2 in the hallway. "She killed 2 guards," Savina's wavelength translated. "She's not some helpless human." "I thought she was supposed to be harmless," one of the politicians was shouting angrily. "I thought it was that Solaire woman we had to worry about. Who is this girlfriend?" The Yibo ambassador, Herrick, stood from his seat at the head of the room, where he'd been talking to a human man who must be Captain Matten. The Yibo's face was tight with anger, and Savina couldn't help a small prickle of satisfaction in her chest at the sight. "I have no idea," Harrock said in Yibo, his voice low and dangerous. "But she's going back to her cell, and Reka is going to have some explaining to do." He gestured with the tip of his tail. "Get these other humans out of here. I'll deal with this." Savina was still whimpering, trembling with fear when Herrick strode over to her. It was an act, mostly, but her stomach twisted at the expression on his face. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he snapped in common dialect, once the remainder of the humans were out of the room. "Why did you kill my guards? Where's Reka?" From the doorway, there was a shout, abruptly cut off. Herrick's head jerked up, and Savina let out a short, quick breath of relief. "It's—" Savina's wavelength translated another guard's shout, then that guard, too, went silent. The glass melted open, and Reka stepped through. She looked as sleek and deadly as a jungle cat, not a hair out of place, her eyes cold and her expression deadly. She took in the room quickly, then spun the gun in her hand, using it like a billy club to knock aside a swath of Yibo guards. One of them made the mistake of bringing their weapon up, and was dead before he'd managed to bring it level. "Take your hands off my girlfriend," hissed Reka, her voice cold and sharp as a knife edge. The guards holding Savina stared, uncertainty on their faces. Reka didn't waste her breath asking a second time, just brought up her weapon. "What in the system?" Savina's wavelength translated. Then Kachik, who'd stumbled in behind Reka, snapped, "Let her go!" The guards jumped back with impressive alacrity, and Savina stumbled, falling to her knees on the floor. She dropped her head to her chest, sobbing quietly. Reka was over to her in 2 strides and dropped down beside her, her arms going tenderly around Savina's shoulders. Savina refused to think about the way her body responded to Reka's touch. "Are you hurt?" Reka's voice was quiet enough. Savina was the only one who could hear it, and thick with real concern. Savina managed a faint shake of her head. Reka gave her shoulders a gentle squeeze, then looked up, glaring at Kachik. "What the hell is this?" she snapped. "You promised she'd be safe if I left her in the cell, and now I find this? What exactly are you trying to do?" Herrick drew in a deep breath, as if trying very hard to control his temper. "Your girlfriend," he said, ice in his tone, "shot 2 of our guards, came bursting in here, fired a gun that took out one of the pillars, and sent this entire section of the building into lockdown. We had to cut off negotiations for the 2nd day in a row. I, too, would like to know what the hell is going on." "Savina?" Reka's voice, now that it was loud enough to be overheard, was gentle. Savina swallowed the stupid lump in her throat. I was just..." she sniffled. "I woke up, and you were gone, and I was afraid to be left all by myself because I know the guards don't like me and—" She broke off, her voice trembling. "Anyway, I know they don't like me, but they respect you, Reka. So I thought I didn't want to bother anyone, so I thought I'd just go find you myself." There was a long moment of silence. At last, Kachik turned to stare at her. "You thought shooting 2 guards and bursting into our main conference room was a good way to find Reka?" His voice was flat and disbelieving. "No," Savina sobbed. "I'm not stupid. I got lost, and then your guards pulled their gun on me, and I went to grab it away because I didn't want to get shot. And the gun went off, and it was awful, and—" Everyone was staring at her now, their expressions registering total disbelief. "You killed 2 of our guards on accident." Kachik's voice was even flatter than before. "You want me to believe this?" "I don't know what you believe, and I don't care what you believe. Just don't hurt me. They tried to shoot me, Reka. They were going to shoot me." She buried her face in Reka's shoulder. Reka put a comforting arm around her, pulling her close, and Savina nestled into her shoulder. Her body was still shaking, and something about Reka's grip was more soothing than she'd like to admit. "You're making her cry." There was a hard menace in Reka's tone. "I would appreciate it if you would stop." Kachik took another long breath. "Savina," he said at last, through his teeth, "if there is something that you need, you are more than welcome to ask the guards. You don't have to let them in if you're afraid of them. You can just call through the door. You are not, however, welcome to go wandering about the government buildings by yourself. You could have been hurt very badly if things had gone differently." Savina gave a terrified little whimper. Reka glowered at Kachik. "And you, Reka," he hissed, turning to her. "You'd better figure out how to either control your girlfriend or give her a milligram of common sense." "I'm not stupid," Savina sobbed. "I was only trying to—" She broke off. Reka's arm around her tightened. "You do not call my girlfriend stupid." Kachik stared in disbelief. "You," he said after a moment, "you just said yourself, just the other day. I am telling you for the last time, do not make Savina cry." Reka's voice was icy. There was a long, long moment where no one spoke. All of the Yibo politicians were staring at them. Savina sobbed harder. Finally, Kachik turned to Savina, his teeth gritted. "I am sorry," he said, as if forcing the words out. Savina blinked at him, then up at Reka. Reka gave her a soft smile, reaching down to wipe the tears from her cheeks. Her fingers were rough and warm, and even though it was just an act, the touch felt almost frighteningly intimate. "There now, Savina," she said. "He apologized. No need to cry." Savina sniffled, trying very hard to fight back the ridiculous heat in her chest. "Now," Reka said coldly, turning back to Kachik, "now that you've finished terrorizing my poor girlfriend, may we please go back to our cell? We'll have to finish our conversation tomorrow. I can't possibly leave Savina alone after all that. I thought this was supposed to be a straightforward arrangement when I agreed to it." Kachik mumbled something under his breath, which Savina's wavelength translated as, "So did I." But he just gave Reka a small, forced smile that was wearier than it had been the day before. It looked, Savina thought with some satisfaction, like he hadn't slept well recently. "Yes," he said. "Let's get you back to your cells." Reka gave a dignified nod. "That would be appreciated." Kachik turned to Harak. "I'm sorry," Savina's AI translated. "Reka is still too useful to kill. Which means we can't kill Savina. You can have the cell guards killed, though. They know better than to let either of these two out of their sight." "I'll do that," said Harak. He still sounded furious. "And now I'm going to spend hours trying to reassure that stupid human captain and his friends again." Kachik's tail twitched in a dismissive gesture. "Once we get him and his pet soldiers on a ship and back through the portal, things should be easier. We'll kill the rest of the humans as soon as they're gone. We can kill them as a group. In their sleep, if we're in a hurry, or if you think the people could use a morale boost, you can bring them out and shoot them one by one in front of the government buildings. It's just a matter of getting the captain and the others through the portal, and if what you're telling me is correct, we're close. But in the meantime, I still need Reka. And she's made it clear she's only going to cooperate if we treat the other one gently, so we're stuck with her for the time being." "She's not as innocent as she looks," Harak hissed. "There's no way she killed 2 guards on accident." "I know." Kachik's look was wry. "But I'll kill her later, when it's more convenient. I'm just asking you to hold things together until then. How close are we?" Harak sighed. "Before this happened, I'd be able to tell you for certain. This," he gestured at Savina and Reka, "may have thrown things off, but before it happened, he was willing to start through the portal as early as tonight. I suspect it will be longer now, since I'll have to placate him, but still, I'd estimate no more than a day or 2. "That's good news," said Kachik. "I have every confidence in your ability." Savina's entire body felt very, very cold. A guard stepped forward, reaching for Savina's hands, and Savina gave a little gasp. Reka turned, and the guard jumped backwards. "Don't," Reka began. "Touch your girlfriend, I know," Kachik finished in resignation, switching back to common dialect. "Perhaps it would be best if you took the restraints off Savina yourself." He gestured to the guard, who handed the unlocking mechanism to Reka. Reka worked deftly, her strong fingers finding and unlocking the restraints, and Savina sighed in shaky relief as they dropped free. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing almost too quickly for her to keep up. With Reka shooting threatening glances at the guards, who stayed well behind them, she and Reka made their way to the cell without incident. Savina stumbled once, and Reka caught her automatically, depositing her back on her feet before she could fall. She frowned at Savina in concern, but Savina shook her head, and Reka turned her gaze forward once more. When they were back in the cell, the doors closed behind them, Savina dropped to the ground, sagging back against the cell wall. Savina. She glanced up, startled. Reka was crouched beside her. "What the hell do you want?" Savina snapped. Her arm throbbed where the Yibo guard had jerked it around, and there were tears that were desperate to well in her eyes. Reka was looking at her, her strange hazel gray eyes catching Savina's and holding them. Her face was lined with weariness, and there was the tension written across her expression, but her gaze was dark with concern. "Savina, are you hurt?" I'm not hurt." Savina tried to make her voice sharp, but it came out more of a squeak. Reka frowned and ran a hand down Savina's arm, and Savina shivered at the touch, then winced as Reka's fingers reached the place where the guard had twisted her arm. Reka's frown deepened, and she tugged Savina's sleeve up gently. "That looks like it hurts." She ran the tips of her fingers over the reddened skin, and again Savina shivered at the touch. "I'll put a bandage on it." Savina snatched her arm out of the woman's grip, scowling. "Don't bother. We're not actually lovers, remember?" Reka sighed. "I haven't forgotten, but we still need to make the guards think I can stand being around you, so sit still and shut up." She turned away brusquely, reaching down for something to wrap Savina's arm with. Savina blinked, savagely. "Anyway, that's not our biggest problem, sweetheart." She put as much spite as she could into the word. "We're damn well out of time. They're going to open the portal any moment. It would have been tonight if it wasn't for what we just did." Reka stared at her. "Are you sure? What did they—" Savina shot her a humorless smile. "They're also going to kill me and every other human here once they get Captain Matten and his friends on the ships. Murder them in their sleep or shoot them in front of the government building is the plan. They might let me live until we reach Colorida again," Kachik didn't specify. Reka's face had gone stony, her lips pinched into a tight line. "You're sure of this?" she said at last, the words sharp as knives. Savina nodded silently. Reka closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, her expression was set and hard, like it always had been before, when they'd been trying to kill each other. "All right, then," she said, in her dispassionate voice. "Your friends won't get to the portal mechanism in time, so our first goal has to be getting the rest of the humans to safety. Then we can think of a different plan to shut down the portal." Savina narrowed her eyes. "What are you talking about? My baby brother is on his way to help shut down the portal mechanism right now. If we don't help him, he dies." "And if you don't listen to me, hundreds of people die," Reka snapped. "Savina, I'm honestly sorry about your brother, but you said it yourself. It's too late. There are hundreds of people out there. We can't let them get slaughtered. We have to change the plan." Savina took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding so quickly she was almost dizzy with it, and she felt vaguely sick to her stomach, but those seemed like distant problems, something happening to someone else. "If you decide not to help me," she said lightly, "I'll make sure Kachik kills both of us, right here, tonight." Reka turned to look at her, her face blank with shock. "I'll do it," said Savina. "He's going to kill me anyways. He said so. And I'll make him kill you too, right here, locked up in this cell. You won't save the rest of the humans either way. I won't let you." "Savina." Reka's voice was sharp with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You'd sacrifice hundreds of people on the off chance you might help your brother? At the very least, we have to warn them." Savina pushed herself to her feet and tried to ignore the hurt and betrayal in Reka's expression. It didn't matter. They were enemies. It didn't matter what Reka thought. "You said it yourself, Reka. I'm a thief and a murderer. Without a single redeeming quality, I burned 5 people alive when I was 12 years old. I tricked them into a house, and then I locked the door and set the whole place on fire and listened to them scream as they burned, because they would have killed my baby brother. One of them was my aunt, another was my uncle." Reka was still staring at her with that mix of loathing and shock. Savina gave her a tight, mocking smile. "So if you think I would hesitate for 1 second to let every damn human on this planet burn, you don't know me at all. Your choice, Reka Soler. We stick with the plan we agreed on, or we both die tonight for nothing." Something shuddered over Reka's eyes, her face going once more blank and expressionless. "Do you have any idea how long it would take your friends to get the mechanism taken down, assuming they could do it?" she asked at last. "I have no idea," Savina spat. "It's my 2 baby siblings, a stupid cargo captain and her crew, and a bunch of geriatrics, longer than tomorrow anyway." Reka nodded, her gaze distant. "All right, if that's our only option, we'll do it." She glanced over at Savina. "So, after everything, you're exactly the heartless murderer I thought you were when I first got your warrant." Savina's heart was pounding, her hands shaking with a mix of helplessness and anger. "Oh, Reka," she said, her voice mockingly sweet. "I thought you'd have learned that a long time ago. I leave the people who think they see some good in me bleeding out on the street, remember?" Reka's expression was frigid. "You're right," she said in a distant tone, turning away. "I was forgetting." Chapter 21. Aaaaand. Aaaaand stared blankly at the walls of the cabin. Josip, I can't leave right now. We're just starting to figure out a cure. I spent all day with a raider scientist, and she thinks there's a possibility." "I understand," said Josip quietly. He hesitated. "Aaaaand, I can't tell you to give this up. I know you've been searching for it your whole life, and goodness knows we'll all be more than grateful for the cure if we ever get it back home, but this is the entire Joias system at stake, and I don't know anyone else we can turn to." He paused. "I can't make you do this, and I can understand why you wouldn't want to, but we don't have anyone else." Aaaaand glanced over. Istvay had sat up and was watching him. "Aaaaand," they began in a low voice, "if it's the fate of the Joias System—" "Just a minute," said Aaaaand tersely into his wavelength. He tapped it off and turned to face Istvay. "Aaaaand," they began again. Aaaaand shook his head. He crossed over and sat down in front of them, cross-legged on the pile of blankets. "I promised you that I'd do whatever it took to get you that cure, but I also promised myself that I wouldn't make decisions that affect both of us all on my own and just expect you to come along, so—" He looked up, catching Istvay's gaze. "Josip said he and Alba, and whatever's left of the diplomatic corps, are trying to destroy the mechanism that opens the portal. They think that would save the Joias system. It means the rest of us are stranded here, but quite frankly, I don't care about that. If you're here and we find a cure, I don't care where we end up. But he says they can't do it without us, which means—" He hesitated, drawing in a deep breath. "Which means we would have to find the cure just from the information we have, or what we can gather in the next day or so. So, what do you think?" Istvay was staring at him, mouth half open in shock. Aaaaand grinned weakly. "Pishti? Was I really that bad when we were back with the Yibo?" At last, Istvay managed a small, wry chuckle. "Aaaaand, you'll have to stop shocking me like this, or I'm going to die from a heart attack before we have time to find a cure." For a few moments, they were silent. "I made a promise too," they said finally. "I promised you that I would take this seriously, that I'd stop being a self-sacrificing idiot I think you called me, but—" They shook their head, and even in the dim light, Aaaaand could see the strain on their face. "But this is the entire system at stake, more lives than either of us can count, and I'd never be able to live with myself knowing I survived only because they died." Istvay took a deep breath. "I want this cure. I want it more than I can possibly explain to you, but we can't leave this." Their voice choked. Aaaaand nodded quietly. Istvay took another deep breath. "I suggest we sneak out tonight. See if it's even possible. The captain isn't going to let us go without a fight, and neither will Desi, if I read her correctly. But just maybe, if we can find the attack pods and they're not too heavily guarded, it's just possible we can make an escape. And tomorrow we can—" They swallowed hard. "We'll get all the information we can from Desi, and maybe it'll be enough we can keep working on a cure without her help." They tried to grin. "We've done more with less information before now." Aaaaand watched them for a minute. He had to bite down hard on his teeth to keep his jaw from trembling. But Istvay was right. He knew them well enough for that. If he told Josip no, even if he found the cure, Istvay would blame themselves for what had happened until their dying day. And he'd promised himself, he'd sworn it. He was going to do whatever he needed to do to see Istvay happy. At last, he managed a nod. Are you sure you're all right with us leaving? Istvay grinned a little, although their face was pale. In the 20-something years we've known each other, I think you know that I'm not usually very coy when I disagree with something. Aaand gave a snort of laughter despite himself, and Istvay's grin widened. I guess I'll call Josip back then, Aaand said. Istvay nodded without speaking. The two of them waited a little longer, until any noise from the ship had died away. Then Aaand lifted Ani onto his shoulder, crept to the door of their cabin, and tried the handle. It opened easily, and he turned to Istvay, raising an eyebrow, and pulled the door gently ajar. The hallway outside was deserted, and it was easy enough work to creep through the empty corridors and down the open hatch until the two of them were standing on the soft ground of the clearing, Ani still perched on Aaand's shoulder. The night air was cool and smelled of moonlight and evergreens, and Aaand closed his eyes and breathed it in. It's been a while, hasn't it? Whispered Istvay. I mean, since we've been outside at night and not been running for our lives. The two of them crept quietly out of the clearing, back to Desi's makeshift trail that led down the side of the mountain. Aaand shivered involuntarily at the memory of the last time he and Istvay had stood on the trail, injured, exhausted at the end of their strength, with the party of raiders after their heads. Istvay gave him a wry glance that told him they were having similar thoughts. They beckoned with their head, and Aaand nodded, and the two of them started forward through the trees. I did actually scout around a little yesterday, Istvay whispered as the two of them walked single file down the narrow trail. I couldn't see much since we're not above the tree line, but it looked like there was a bit of a saddle in the mountain in that direction, and it was more a scree slope than anything. If we can get there, we should be able to get a clear view at least. They pointed. Aaand nodded, and the two of them stepped off the faint trail and into the trees. Istvay was stumbling more than usual, and Aaand consciously slowed his footsteps. Istvay's stubborn expression told him his friend wouldn't accept being babied, but at least Aaand could give them both a level of plausible deniability. With as slow as they were going, and with the forced caution of having to look out for any more of Kravai's traps as they went, the moon was high in the sky by the time they reached the scree slope Istvay had seen earlier from the clearing. Aaand glanced up at one of the trees on the edge of the slope. I'll climb up. I should be able to see the landing pad from there if it's where the captain said it was. I'll come too, said Istvay. It'll be better with two pairs of eyes. There was a familiar stubbornness to their expression that told Aaand it would be no use to argue. He sighed. If you're sure you can make it... Istvay glared at him. I told you I was going to stop faking being all right when I wasn't. So if I say I can make it... Aaand chuckled. You mean you gave yourself an excuse to be even grumpier than usual when I ask you about it? He whispered. Istvay glared and didn't dignify his question with an answer. Aaand started up the tree with Istvay close behind, and soon both of them were high enough up that they could see over the lip of the slope and across the stretch of the mountain below them. There, said Istvay at last. Aaand looked over to where they were pointing. Sure enough, there was a distant glimmer in the moonlight, the sleek black outlines of what must be the raider attack pods nestled into a clearing on the far side of the saddle. Istvay fumbled one-handed in their supplies pouch and brought out a pair of battered binoculars. It's not guarded too heavily, they said after a few minutes, passing the binoculars to Aaand. From the sounds of it, Kravai has a reputation, so maybe he's not too worried. Aaand raised the binoculars to his own eyes, dialing them into focus. Istvay had been right. There were only two guards, and both had the casual stance and relaxed posture of people who weren't expecting trouble. Look, on the far side of the clearing, Istvay whispered. From the look of it, there are a couple of pods that are out of the sight range of where the guards are positioned. It's just possible, if we could get through there and the pods are as quiet as the raider ships are, that they wouldn't notice the pod was missing until the next morning, depending on how alert the guards are. Aaaaand nodded, lowering the binoculars. I'm sure they have trackers on them, though. Istvay grinned at him. They do, as a matter of fact. I talked to one of the crew this afternoon, but I looked at the mechanism, and assuming the tracker is similar to the one on their main ship, a standard blocker would shut it down, at least temporarily. Aaaaand turned, grinning back at his friend, and for a moment they were staring into each other's eyes. It would have been incredibly awkward, honestly, even a few weeks ago, but now Aaaaand was able to feel nothing but happiness. Istvay's eyes widened, darker than usual in the moonlight. There was an odd expression on their face, and they didn't pull their gaze away, even when he expected them to. He turned away, breaking off the gaze, feeling a little shaky, and pulled his mind back to the present. Behind him, he heard Istvay let out a long breath. Well, they said at last, their voice not quite steady, we'd best get back. From the look of that moon, we'll barely make it back in time as it is. Yeah, said Aaaaand, clearing his throat. Yeah, you're right. The two of them made their rapid way down the tree in a shower of bark and needles, and Ani protested irritably from her perch on Aaaaand's shoulder. You could have climbed up yourself, Ani, he grumbled. It would have saved me carrying both of us. She latched herself tighter onto his shoulders. I think we're going to have to go down and around, said Istvay. They were standing at the lip of the scree slope. It'll take too long to go all the way up and around that outcropping like we did on the way here, and we don't have a lot of time left. Aaaaand nodded silently, and the two of them started down the mountain. It wasn't until they reached the foot of the mountain and made their way around the thin outcropping of cliff that Aaaaand realized that something was wrong. He wasn't sure he would have noticed it, even then, if it hadn't been for the way Ani tensed on his shoulders, her posture perking up, suddenly alert. Then he did notice. The quiet sounds of the nighttime forest, the soft hum of insects, and the faint rustle of small animals through the undergrowth had stilled. Oh, hell, Istvay whispered. And then from the trees behind them came a soft, all too familiar voice. Hello, little humans. There are lots of people looking for you these days, aren't there? Humans, Yibo, raiders, but it looks like we got here first. Aaaaand and Istvay looked at each other for a split second, then dived into the undergrowth, Aaaaand holding Ani firmly to his shoulder, despite her spitting protests, and shoved frantically through the brush towards the slope of the mountain. That must be Captain Sharda's crew. Good hell! How long were those damn raiders planning to wait for us? Istvay said through gritted teeth as they climbed. They clearly have way too much damn time on their hands. And what the hell were they talking about with their Yibos and humans? Here. They threw back a small pouch of scent blocker, and Aaaaand caught it neatly. He smeared it over himself as the two of them stumbled along, the sound of pursuit clear in the background, then activated the pouch, shoving it in his pocket. You all right? He whispered. Istvay gave a terse nod. But we're not going to make it far enough up the mountain. They're too close, and they're faster than we are. Then let's find somewhere to hide until we can damn well figure out how to get rid of them, Aaaaand whispered through his teeth. Istvay slowed, already breathing heavily. A moment later, they gestured to a small depression that looked like it had been cut out by seasonal runoff. Aaaaand nodded, too breathless to speak, and the two of them tumbled down the short, steep slope and into the ditch. Their pursuers were only meters behind, from the sounds of it. In there! Aaaaand hissed, shoving Istvay towards an undercut in the bank. Istvay wriggled inside, and Aaaaand clambered in after them. The space was barely big enough for one, let alone two, and they were crammed in so tightly there was hardly room to breathe, but as long as they were perfectly still, they should be out of sight. He pulled Ani against his chest, whispering something soothing in her ear, and for a wonder she didn't protest. Then they were quiet, waiting. Above them, he could hear the approaching raiders, their footsteps quiet on the forest floor. They walked slowly, as if trying to catch a trail, but without Aaaaand and Istvay's scent to guide them, the trail would be difficult to follow in the moonlight. The footsteps paused on the bank above them. More footsteps approached, and there was whispered conversation, then the rustle of someone making their quiet way into the ditch. Aaaaand held his breath, willing his heart to slow, one hand loosely around Ani. If they were perfectly still, he was pretty sure their hiding place was virtually undetectable. But then, he'd never been hunted by something like these raiders before. He was pressed so tightly against Istvay that he could feel every rise and fall of their chest, the rapid pounding of their heart, the warmth of their breath against the back of his neck. The raider was close enough he could hear the creature's quiet breathing. Aaaaand shifted, and he felt Istvay's breath hitch. He was very aware suddenly of the warmth of Istvay's body pressed against his, the way their arm had come up around him, pulling him close to make more room. He closed his eyes. This was not something he needed to be thinking about right now. In the ditch below, the raiders' footsteps were slow and methodical, a steady back and forth. Aaaaand gritted his teeth, trying to steady his breath. Istvay must have felt him stiffen, because they tightened their hand on his arm in a reassuring gesture, and he put his hand over theirs with a quick squeeze of gratitude. At last, there was another whispered conversation, then a quick, light scramble of footsteps as the raider pulled himself up the side of the ditch. There was more quiet conversation, and the footsteps above them faded away. Aaaaand squeezed Istvay's hand again in warning, listening closely. It was possible this was a trap. The raiders could have left someone behind, waiting to see if they emerged. Istvay must have come to the same conclusion, because they didn't try to move, and for a few minutes the three of them stayed pressed into the hollow. Aaaaand's back pushed up against the warmth of Istvay's chest, his legs tangled with theirs. Istvay's arms slung low over his hips. At last, Aaaaand lifted his head, trying to peer out. He gave Ani a soothing pat, then pushed back against Istvay, trying to see through the narrow opening. Istvay's breath hitched again, but there was a small gap in the tree roots above him, and he was pretty sure if he could just maneuver himself a little farther up. He wriggled, trying to find a position that would afford him a view of the bank. Istvay gave a muffled groan. "You okay?" Aaaaand whispered, shifting again in an attempt to give them more room. "I can just... maybe if I..." "Aaaaand!" Istvay's voice was strained. "For the love of the holy mystery, would you please stop moving?" Aaaaand froze, and he felt Istvay take a long, shuddering breath. "Sorry," he whispered. It's fine." Istvay's voice was still strained. Just give me a sec." Finally, when Istvay's breathing had evened out a little, their heartbeat steadying from the spike of earlier, they said carefully, "Are they gone?" I think so," whispered Aaaaand, being careful to stay entirely still. "I was trying to check when... Anyway, there's a gap in the roots up here, but I can't quite see out of it from where I am." He felt Istvay take another deep breath. "All right, I'm going to push you up so you can see better. Okay?" Aaaaand nodded. Istvay's arm slid off his hip, and he felt an odd pang of disappointment. Then their hands were on his shoulder blades, lifting him. He peered out through the narrow opening. "I can't see anyone," he whispered. "I can't see the whole bank, but at least there's no one right over top of us." He glanced quickly to one side. "And Ani doesn't seem upset. Well, if we don't get back soon, there will be 2 groups of raiders hunting us. And I'm not sure either of us wants to deal with that, so we'll have to take our chances." Aaaaand nodded carefully. He scooted back, trying to get his feet under him, which, despite his best efforts, shoved him against Istvay once more. Istvay sucked in a sharp breath. "Pishti?" he asked anxiously, turning back. Just get up, okay?" Istvay was speaking through their teeth. Aaaaand sighed, but did as Istvay asked, and a moment later he was out. It was another moment before Istvay emerged, and when they did, their face looked slightly flushed in the moonlight. They didn't meet his eyes, just glared up at the sky. "We should get going. We'll be pushing it to make it back to the ship before morning as it is. We'll worry about getting our hands on a key for the pods when we're back there." Istvay was right. By the time the 3 of them reached the raider ship again, the sky was beginning to gray, and they could already hear the soft hum and bustle of the ship waking up. On the bright side, the night guards were tired and not paying much attention, and it was easy enough to sneak past them. It was harder to make their way through the ship's corridors, now that raiders were coming and going with their morning tasks, but they reached their room undetected, slid through the door, and managed to drop down onto the nest of blankets moments before someone tapped on the door with their breakfast. Chapter 22. Alba. By the time Alba woke, the ship had come to a halt. She blinked and rolled up into a sitting position. The sky through the small portholes was dark. She must have slept the day through. Her entire body ached, but it had become such a familiar feeling that she was no longer certain how it felt not to hurt when she woke. She made her way stiffly out of the small cabin and into the mess room, where Joska, Raffel, Benny, Nicolau, Inez, and Feliu were already gathered. Josip joined them a few minutes later. "I've been looking at that map of yours, Chief Justice," said Joska quietly. "We should be close to where the mechanism is, but from what I can tell, they have quite the security apparatus around it. I suggest we walk from here, since I'm pretty sure an unidentified craft is going to cause more concern than we want to deal with, and we don't know how well it's guarded." "We don't know how well it's guarded, but I think pretty heavily is a safe bet," Raffel muttered. Joska sighed. "As much as I hate to admit it, you're probably right." Raffel gave a snort of laughter. "You never like to admit I'm right, Captain. You may as well save your breath on that point." Joska chuckled, and glancing between them, Alba saw the genuine affection in their faces. "Well," said Joska, "I suppose no point in wasting any more time. I should have some night vision goggles on board somewhere, although if you've got the retinal implants in your wavelengths, you probably don't need them." Joska had parked the ship near the base of a large hill. The walk, and then the climb to the top, couldn't have been more than a kilometer or so in total, but it felt like 50. If it hadn't been for Nicolau's assistance, Alba wasn't sure she'd have made it at all. Then, at last, they crested the hill, and their destination came into sudden, unmistakable view. It was a massive complex, surrounded by a heavy, spiked fence, and covered over with a force field. From the top of the fence, brilliant floodlights shone out across the small valley. "Well," said Joska, after a long moment of silence. Alba didn't have anything more articulate to add. The valley below them was flooded with lights and swarming with guards, and watching the scene, Alba felt her stomach sink. "Well," said Joska again. "There's no way we're going to get in there," whispered Nicolau. Alba was tempted to snap at him, but he was right. This was simply impossible. She felt the weariness to the very core of her being. She turned, at last, to Josip. "You spoke with Aaaaand and Istvay. Are they going to come?" Josip hesitated. "They're in a bit of a difficult position at present, and they weren't sure they'd be able to get out. But they said they'd do their best." "Perhaps if we made it clear that the fate of the entire Joias system depends on them being able to get out?" Alba snapped. She knew her irritation stemmed more from the sick panic she felt at the sight in front of them than it did from either Josip or the errant scientist and his friend, but she was too exhausted to temper her words. Josip sighed and shook his head. "I'm sure they'll do the best they can, and we will simply have to hope." Alba could still hear Aaand's words from back on the escape pod. "I am damn well finding that cure, if I have to die to do it." And she could still see the way he looked at his friend when he said it. All at once she was hit with a sudden, unexpected pang, an odd sort of ache at the realization that this ragged young man who'd spent his life in the most remote reaches of the system had the one thing she, whose life had been dedicated to the public trust, had never allowed herself even to dream of. Josip shot her a weary smile. He was worried that if he and Istvay come, they might put the raiders on our trail, but I took the liberty of informing them that at this point that's the least of our concerns. There was no sentimentality in his words, just a simple matter-of-factness. But Alba knew he understood the implications of what he was saying. If the raiders found them after they'd destroyed the portal, they'd be killed. But then, once she'd made the decision to destroy the portal mechanism, Alba had never expected to come out of this alive. She lifted her head. "Thank you," she said quietly. He smiled at her, a soft, weary smile, And Alba realized that something would leave the system when Josip died, something fragile and fleeting and precious. By the time they made their weary way back to the ship, Alba was thoroughly exhausted. Joska sent Nicolau, Benny, and Inez off to bed with the admonition to get as much rest as they could, as they'd likely be needed soon. Then she and Rafael settled themselves with Alba, Josip, and Feliu on the cramped main deck of the ship. "Chief Justice," Joska asked quietly, "this is your plan. What do you think?" Alba drew in a long breath. "It's no more than we should have expected, I suppose," she said, trying to keep the exhaustion from her tone. "I suggest that—" "Joska!" Alba looked up, irritated at the interruption, to see Nicolau stumble into the cabin. His face was pale, his eyes wide in panic. "Joska! Joska, we need—" Joska stood quickly, putting out a hand to steady the frantic young man. "What is it, Nicolau? What's wrong?" "Savina." His voice choked. "They're going to kill her. She called to warn us that the Yibo will be opening the portal soon, and when I told her we'd come for her as soon as we were done here, she told me that once the portal was down there was no need to come back. And..." He took a deep breath. "I'm going after Vina. I have to. She's my sister, Joska." There was a pleading look in his eyes and desperation in his tone. "Benny's coming too. We already talked about it. You can stay, Captain, but this—" Joska put up a hand to stop him and turned back to Alba and the others, a wry look on her face. "Give me a minute," she said, then put her hand on the young man's arm and steered him out of the cabin. Alba, Josip, Feliu, and Rafael were left looking at each other. At last, Rafael shook his head. "That little idiot is going to lose his mind if we don't come up with a way to save his sister," he said gruffly. "Heaven help us if we were ever that young and stupid." But there was a reluctant fondness in his tone. Joska came back a few minutes later. Her face was grim, but Nicolau, who was trailing behind her, looked a little calmer. "Well," said Joska, resuming her seat, "it looks like our favorite murderer is in trouble. And Benny and Nicolau aren't going to leave it unless we do something." She sighed. "I figured of the three of us, Nicolau would be the most use here. And Rafael, as fond as I am of you, your days of storming a building are over. Between you, Alba, with your map, and Josip's apparent ability to make friends with the rain clouds themselves, I figure that once Aaaaand and Istve get here, Rafael and I will be a bit redundant anyway. And there's no power in the mystery's vastness that will persuade Benny to stay behind when Savina's in danger. So, when our scientists get here, I'll leave Nicolau and Inez with you, and the rest of us will go see if we can keep Savina alive a little longer." For a long time there was silence in the cabin. At last, Alba nodded. "I suppose that will have to do," she said, trying to keep the irritation from her tone. Chapter 23. Aaaaand. "Aaaaand!" He blinked his eyes open, his head snapping up. Desi was watching him in mild exasperation. "I thought this was something you were interested in." "Oh, it is. I'm very interested," he mumbled, blinking hard and scrubbing at his eyes with his knuckles. "I'm sorry, I guess I didn't sleep well last night." He'd gone out to check on Istve when Desi had insisted they pause for a noonday meal, only to find them sprawled out on the forest floor, fast asleep. He'd pulled off his jacket and draped it over them, smiling, then gone back into the lab. But even the fresh air hadn't really been enough to wake him up. "I'd love to see the genotype analysis that ran overnight," he said, trying to bring himself back to full alertness. Desi chuckled. "Here, I thought we were working on developing this cure together, and all you keep doing is asking for my baseline information. If I didn't know better, I'd think you were trying to get all my data so you could develop the cure on your own and one-up me." Aaaaand managed a smile that he hoped didn't look too guilty. The raider scientist had already bent over her datapad, paging through the information. "Here it is," she said at last. "Actually, perhaps that's a good idea after all. I'll give you everything I have, and we can look at it separately, as well as together. Perhaps one of us will find something that the other hasn't seen yet." She paused a moment, then turned, handing him a datapad. "There. I transferred it all onto here. I don't know how your devices work, that's not my specialty, but you know how to work a datapad, right? He gave the datapad a wary look, and she sighed. Here, let me show you. By the end of the day, Aaaaand had not only all the underlying data, but a working knowledge of how to use the datapad. His heart was pounding strangely. Josip had said he'd call them again when they got to the mechanism, and then he'd have to leave, because it was what Istvay wanted. Sure enough, he and Istvay barely had time to finish dinner when Josip's call came through Aaaaand's wavelink. Aaaaand. Josip's voice was weary and strained. We're here. The portal mechanism's heavily guarded, and none of us has the experience we need to get inside. Aaaaand glanced at Istvay. Their face was tense, and they were watching him steadily. We'll come, said Aaaaand softly. Tonight, after the raiders are asleep, we'll come. Ani had snuggled her bulbous body up next to him, seeming to sense his distress, and he stroked her absently. His hands were shaking. Josip let out a long breath that told Aaaaand clearer than words how relieved he was. Thank you. I'll send the map and directions to your wavelink. He paused. How long will it take you to get here, do you think? Aaaaand glanced at Istvay. Pishti, do you know... He began, then yawned so widely that for a moment he couldn't talk. Istvay gave him a tight grin. Aaaaand's wavelink buzzed, and he tapped his palm screen. A holographic map sprang up around his hand, and Istvay came over to peer at it. They frowned at the map for a few minutes, then shrugged. In the escape pod, I would have said something like 36 Colorita hours, but from what I've seen of these raider ships, I think we can cut that down to something like 12. Aaaaand relayed the information to Josip. And you'll be able to get away? Josip asked. Aaaaand glanced at Istvay and managed a small smile. I hope so. We have some experience with this sort of thing. Istvay was able to steal a key to one of the pods, and with any luck, it will be a few hours before the raiders notice we're missing. But I can't promise they won't come after us the moment they do. I know, said Josip quietly. If we had more time, perhaps we could take better precautions, but as things stand, as long as we have a few hours to take down the mechanism, we'll have to worry about the rest afterwards. He paused. We'll wait for you here. Get here as soon as you can. I don't know how much longer we have before the portal opens. Yeah, said Aaaaand quietly. We'll get there as fast as we can. He tapped off his wavelink and turned to Istvay. I spent today getting all the baseline information from Desi so we could keep working on the cure. We'll go help them, but I'm not going to leave this. I'm not giving up. I know, said Istvay, their voice almost inaudible. For a while, the two of them tried to pass the time until the raiders went to bed with a game of dice, but soon Aaaaand was yawning so hugely that Istvay chuckled and shoved him over towards the pile of blankets. Lie down. I'll wake you up when it's time. I had a nap. I'll be fine. Aaaaand nodded and stumbled over to the nest of blankets. He didn't even remember closing his eyes. He awoke to a soft touch on his shoulder and a voice whispering, Aaaaand? He sat up with a jerk, and Istvay caught him before he overbalanced, and he blinked his eyes open centimeters away from Istvay's face. Their arms were around him, holding him steady, their mouth close to his, and he could see where their lips were chapped. And he must have been still half asleep because he reached out to touch where the dry skin was cracking. And then he came fully awake and realized suddenly where he was and what he was doing. His thumb brushing Istvay's lips, his face so close to theirs that all he would have to do was lean in, just a little. Istvay didn't pull back, though, just stayed there, watching him. Their eyes were wide and dark, and Aaaaand found he wasn't actually breathing. Aaaaand, they said at last, their voice rough. It's time to go. Aaaaand swallowed hard and nodded, but still Istvay didn't pull away. And, they said, look, Aaaaand, you and I, we need to talk, okay? Aaaaand's mouth was suddenly very, very dry, but he managed to nod anyways. All right, said Istvay, their voice not quite steady. All right. We'll talk as soon as we get this stupid portal shut down, okay? Okay, said Aaaaand. his mind gone completely blank. His heart was still beating quick and strange in his chest as the two of them, with Aaand perched on Aaand's shoulder, made their way out of their room and off the ship. Istvay didn't seem to be doing much better. Twice, Aaand had to grab their jacket to hold them back from stepping out in front of one of the guards. They shot him an apologetic grin both times, but neither incident seemed enough to refocus their attention. Finally, though, they made it out of the clearing and reached the attack pods. Istvay took a deep breath and closed their eyes for a moment, visibly trying to regain their focus. At last, they opened their eyes and grinned shakily. "Well," they said, "shall we?" There were raider guards posted, but they didn't seem overly worried about a challenge, and in the dim moonlight it was easy enough to creep past them. The key Istvay had stolen opened the pod hatch, and once inside, it only took Istvay a few minutes before they looked up, a gleam of satisfaction in their eyes. "Got it," they whispered. "Better strap in. I set the blocker on the tracking device, and we'll fly low for a bit to get some distance, so our trip through atmosphere won't be quite as noticeable, but if they see us leaving, we're going to be in a hell of a hurry." Aaand nodded, swallowing hard. He hated this part. He'd never not hate this part. "It'll be over soon," said Istvay, their voice softening. "You can go into the back as soon as we're clear, okay?" Aaand nodded, closing his eyes to fight back the helpless panic. Istvay laid their hand on his arm for just a moment. Then they turned to the controls, and the pod rose silently, then shot forwards. Aaand choked out a curse as his stomach dropped. The ground blurred under them, and he clenched his teeth, trying not to be sick. "Going up," Istvay whispered a few minutes later, and the ship's trajectory turned vertical. The entire craft shook as they pushed through the atmosphere, and Aaand squeezed his eyes more tightly, Ani's tentacles gripping his shoulder, the only thing keeping him from hyperventilating. At last, the craft steadied, and Aaand let out a short, shaky breath. "Aaand," Istvay's voice was gentle. "Aaand, go on. Into the back, okay? I didn't see anyone after us, so I think we're clear." Aaand nodded, swallowing hard against the sick panic. He managed to unclench his hands from the arms of the co-pilot seat and stumbled toward the back of the ship, where at least he wouldn't be able to see the blackness of space around them. Istvay came to find him a few minutes later. They put a hand on his shoulder and sat with him, and Ani stroked his cheek gently with her tentacles, chirping softly, until at last he was able to open his eyes. "Are you all right?" Istvay's eyes were dark with their typical concern. Aaand managed a weak nod. Istvay smiled, but their hand stayed on his shoulder. Aaand couldn't help but remember a few hours ago, sitting so close to Istvay, he could feel the warmth of their breath on his face. His thumb running gently across their chapped lips, their arms around him. "Pishti," he began, his voice hoarse. "Pishti, you said you wanted to... that we should..." Istvay cleared their throat. "Yeah," they said, looking away. "Yeah, I wanted to..." They shifted, dropping their hand from his arm. Look, it's late and you haven't had any sleep. We should..." "No, it's fine, I'm fine, Aaand stammered. His heart was pounding and he couldn't seem to catch his breath. We can talk when we finish with the portal," Istvay muttered. Aaand could practically feel the tension from his friend. They stood abruptly, and Aaand stood as well, quickly enough that Ani gave a startled grumble and grabbed his arm for balance. "Pishti! Wait!" Istvay froze. Can't we..." He wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. Istvay took a deep breath and turned back to him. "I promise," they said with a wan half-smile. Look, I'm sorry, I need a little time, okay?" They squeezed his shoulder, and just for a moment he was caught in their gaze again, and it was as if all the work he'd done over the last however many weeks to actually damn well deal with this hadn't happened at all. Then they turned and were gone, leaving Aaand staring after them. He was certain he'd never be able to sleep, ever again for the rest of his life after that. But the strain of the last few days, combined with the previous night's adventures, was, enough to overcome even his Istvay-induced insomnia, and the next thing he remembered, Istvay was shaking him awake. "Aaaaand," they whispered. They looked like they'd just woken up themselves. "We're almost there. Are you ready?" Aaaaand nodded groggily and sat up, and Istvay shot him a strained smile before turning back to the cockpit. "I'm going to take it off autopilot," they called back. "If you can manage it, come up here. I've never piloted a ship like this before, and I wouldn't mind a hand." Between the two of them, they put the ship down not far from the coordinates Josip had sent, and started off on foot. When he and Istvay reached the others, they found them in a small camp in a dip between two hills. Aaaaand frowned, glancing around. "How did you get here? I thought you had a ship." Josip smiled, although the expression was weary. "We did, but it turns out a friend of our captain was in trouble. Once we knew you were coming, she said she was going to fetch her." "What happened to you?" asked Istvay. "The question should be, what didn't happen to us?" said Feliu sourly. "Aaaaand, Istvay." Alba stood, crossing over to them. She looked exhausted, puffy circles under her eyes, the bones in her face standing out as if she'd hardly been eating or sleeping. "I appreciate you coming," she said quietly. Aaaaand stared. Of all the greetings he'd expected from Alba, this was not one of them. Istvay looked as taken aback as he felt, but they didn't comment, just nodded. "Aaaaand!" He looked over to see a young man who looked vaguely familiar from his time on the ship. Aaaaand had to fight back a groan at the hero worship in the kid's face. "Aaaaand!" He was grinning widely. "I honestly never thought I'd—" He paused, trailing off. I'm sorry. It's probably not the time." No, it's fine," said Aaaaand weakly. As much as he hated the attention, there was a boyish eagerness in the young man's face that he couldn't bear to crush. "So," he said instead, "what are we working with?" In the end, they eschewed long explanations in favor of Nicolau leading them to the top of the hill overlooking the compound. Istvay gave a low whistle. "Well, they're not exactly being subtle about this, are they?" Aaaaand pulled the binoculars out of his pouch, scanning the compound quickly. "It's not going to be easy getting in there," he said after a moment. "No," said Istvay dryly. "No, I don't think it will be." They paused, holding their hand out for the binoculars. Aaaaand handed them over, and they peered through them for a few moments before lowering them and looking over at Aaaaand. "Are you seeing what I'm seeing, though?" Aaaaand grinned. "That bit over in the far corner?" Istvay nodded, grinning as well, and dropped their knapsack to the ground. "I'll stay here. I need to figure out the guards' patterns. You go back with the others. Try to get some sleep. One of us has to be awake if we want to get in there." Aaaaand dropped his own knapsack. "Pretty sure I've slept on the ground before. It'll be easier if I stay. That way I can spell you off if you need it." Istvay gave him a reluctant smile. "Fine, but I don't need you falling asleep on the job like you were back on the raider ship." Aaaaand rolled his eyes and Istvay chuckled. "All right," Aaaaand whispered to Nicolau. "You go back, Istvay and I will stay here. Tell the others we'll be back in a couple hours, hopefully with a plan of some sort, and in the meantime they should get as much sleep as they can." The wide-eyed Nicolau nodded and turned back the way he'd come. The silence when he was gone was somehow much more awkward than Aaaaand remembered it being. Istvay was on their stomach, the binoculars propped up to their eyes, looking fixedly down at the compound below. Aaaaand sighed and unstrapped his equipment pouch, pillowing his head on it, and stared up at the unfamiliar stars. Ani pushed her way up under his arm like she did most nights, with diffident little movements, like she thought maybe if she was careful he wouldn't notice. He shook his head and hid a fond smile, rubbing her under the chin as she purred. "Put on a blanket, idiot." He looked up in time to get hit in the face by Istvay's emergency blanket. "Idiot yourself," Aaaaand grumbled, grinning. "Anyways, you need a blanket too. Not like it'll be warmer just because you're awake for it." He rummaged in his knapsack and pulled out another blanket, which he tossed at Istvay. It hit them, covering them and the binoculars. They sputtered, fumbling their way out, then turned to glare at Aaaaand. He gave a snort of laughter, and Istvay rolled their eyes, chuckling reluctantly. Aaaaand lay back again, pulling the blanket around him and Ani. He'd barely closed his eyes, though, when a bright light seared across the sky, visible even behind his closed eyelids. He opened his eyes, blinking. Istvay had turned as well, and they were frowning, pointing their binoculars towards the sky. Then they cursed. "Aaaaand! I know exactly who that is." Their voice was strained. Aaaaand frowned, then, abruptly, he swore as well. "It's Captain Krevai, isn't it?" Istvay nodded. Aaaaand tipped his head back. "Damn it, I thought we'd have at least a few hours." He blew out a quick breath. "We've got to get back to warn the others. This is not good." "No," said Istvay grimly. "No, it's really not." Chapter 24. Savina. "Reka, darling," Savina purred, sitting on the cot and curling up against Reka's back. Reka turned, her face dark with anger. "What is it?" she snapped. "This had better not be another one of your jokes, Savina." Savina widened her eyes, then thought better of it. "No," she said quietly. "It's no joke." She sent the scan of the building with her markup to Reka's wavelength and waited as the woman pulled it up. "I have it," said Reka shortly. "What are you planning?" Savina took a deep breath. "Do you see how the water lines are laid out?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, because she was afraid it would tremble, and she didn't want Reka to hear that. "If I got out and I set off an explosion in the pipes where I've marked, if you look at where the switches are, this wouldn't show up on the sensors for a while. I bet we could flood the entire records room. That might keep them busy enough trying to fix it that they delay for a little longer. They're not going to want to lose the records of all their discussions with Matin." Reka was quiet for a moment, studying the diagram. At last she looked up, her eyes hooded. "If they catch you, they'll kill you." Savina swallowed hard. "I know." She'd meant it to come out carelessly, but her voice shook too much for that. "I told you, I'm good at getting myself out of bad situations." She was a bit more successful with the carefree tone this time. Reka studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Like you say, we're just trying to buy time for people who actually matter." She turned away, and Savina couldn't fight the sharp, stinging ache at the careless dismissal. "Well, Reka, we'll see if the Yibo can succeed where you failed," she said lightly. "It takes talent to be as bad at this as you are. Follow me all the way through the portal like an overeager puppy, team up with the raiders and still not be able to kill me." She slid off the cot, and she could hear the bitterness in her own voice. "But as long as you follow orders like a good little soldier, right? I hardly know why you're doing this, to be honest. If you just need orders to follow, it seems to me you could follow Kachik's orders just as easily as you could follow." Reka grabbed her by the front of the tunic, and Savina sucked in a quick breath, a mix of fear and sick vindication. Something inside her craved the sight of Reka losing her stupid calm, that disdain, that detached amusement she looked at Savina with. Savina wanted to see it gone. Savina wanted to make Reka so angry she couldn't see straight. Reka yanked Savina upright, and Savina glared into those eyes, dark with fury, and she wanted... Then Reka took a deep breath and stepped away, letting go of Savina with a gesture of disgust. "Better get ready, then. I'll unlock the door for you when it's dark." Her voice had regained its old indifference, and she turned her back on Savina. The day seemed endless. Savina wrapped herself in the blanket Reka had thrown her and tried to nap in the corner, but she couldn't seem to fall asleep. When she finally did, it was to restless, unsettling dreams that she couldn't remember when she woke. At last, the guards appeared with their dinner. They looked around the cell warily, but on seeing both Savina and Reka where they belonged, they left the food and stood at a respectful distance outside the cell while Savina and Reka ate. Then they carried the dishes away. When they were gone, Savina and Reka sat in silence for a few minutes. Savina didn't deign to look at Reka, glaring instead at the corner of their cell. She still wasn't sure whether she was more angry with Reka or with herself. At last, Reka stood and made her way over to crouch next to her. "Are you ready?" she whispered. Damn her to the void. Savina pasted on a smile as she turned. I'm always ready, sweetheart. You forget that at your peril. Good, said Reka indifferently, rising. Then I'll get the door open for you. It only took her a moment to pick the lock, but she hesitated as Savina came over. What are you going to tell them as an excuse this time? She asked. There's a limit to how much I'll be able to do to help you, and this may cross that line. Savina frowned. Reka looked actually worried. That same ache from earlier jabbed into Savina's chest, cold and sharp. This was pretend. It was all pretend, and Reka would be laughing about it the moment Savina was gone. She gave Reka a dazzling smile. Don't bother your pretty head about it, sweetheart. I can take care of myself. She pushed past Reka and slipped out the door without looking back. By the time she reached the hallway that led down to the pipes, the furious, seething anger in her chest had dulled to a cold emptiness. But her hands were trembling as she broke through the lock into the room that held the main water line. Reka was right. There really wasn't a whole lot she could say to cover this one up. Hard to argue that she'd gotten lost in the middle of the night, stumbled into the waterworks, and accidentally set off an explosion. Maybe she'd get back to her cell before they caught her. That was her only hope, really. If Reka would even let her back in. It didn't matter. She was trying to save her brother, and what some damn government agent thought of her didn't matter at all. She took a deep breath, trying to still her hands. It would be difficult to set off an explosive if her hands were shaking so hard she blew it up before she'd managed to plant it. The thought of the smirk on Reka's face at the news gave her the jolt of fury she needed to steady herself. She reached into her pocket, retrieving the explosive Reka had given her. The woman had said once it was set, Savina would have about 60 seconds to get out. It was possible Reka was lying. The memory of the glittering hatred in the woman's gaze after their argument the night before still shook Savina, just a little. But she probably hadn't been lying. As long as Reka had a use for her, she'd keep her alive. She glanced one final time at the diagrams she'd sketched out, wishing irrationally that Benny was here. Benny had always been better at planning things than Savina was, and pinpointed the place she'd need to plant the explosive to cause the maximum amount of damage. Then she crept across the empty room, her breath catching in her throat at every sound. By the time she reached her destination, all her original bravado had disappeared. She sucked in a breath, staring at the tangle of pipes. The Yibo would kill her for this. Not that it bloody well mattered to anyone but her. She pulled out the explosive, taking another deep breath to calm her shaking nerves. She activated it, tapped the timer, and nestled it in the center of the tangle of pipes, then jumped to her feet and took off running. She made the door, and was outside and 3/4 of the way down the first hallway when the explosion went off. It was soft, nothing to attract too much attention, but a few seconds later, a trickle of water bloomed along the hallway by her feet. In moments, the trickle had turned into a stream, and the stream into a flood. Soon, Savina was splashing through water high enough to soak her shoes, then high enough to wet her ankles. She walked as quickly as she could, trying to balance the need for speed with the need for silence. The closer she could get back to the cell before they found her, the higher her chance of living through this. And then she heard the sound she'd been dreading, the splash of running footsteps and a guard's voice shouting. Her wavelength translated their words. There she is! It's that stupid human girl again! Savina turned, her eyes wide, raised her hands to show she was weaponless. I didn't do anything! I saw the water and I came to find someone. There was a soft pop, and Savina gasped at a sharp, shocking pain, her right leg buckling under her. The guards had reached her by now, and one of them grabbed Savina, slamming her head against the wall. She bit her tongue, tasting blood. He smashed her head into the wall again, and she gave a choked scream, blood pooling in her mouth and streaming down her throat as she gagged. He backhanded her, and there was another explosion of pain, sharp and sudden and hot as her nose burst with blood. The guard shoved her away from him in disgust, and she collapsed into the water, sobbing. She wasn't sure anymore if she was sobbing for real or in a last, desperate attempt to save her life. Another guard splashed over and hauled her to her feet, fastening restraints around her wrists. Where do we take her? Take her with the other. Onto the ship. Savina heard the words through the fog of pain. Blood streamed down her face and chin and dripped onto her tunic, splashing into the water below her. The water around her was a bright, shocking red, and tendrils of darker red blood twisted in streams from her injured leg. When the guard let go of her again, she dropped to the ground, choking and whimpering, heedless of the water soaking through her thin tunic. The pain in her leg was almost enough to make her woozy, and blood soaked through her clothing, clinging hot and sticky to her skin. The guards jerked her to her feet again, and this time there was nothing faked in her whimper. "Should we just kill her?" asked the guard, holding her. "Even Reka can't possibly believe this idiot is doing this on accident." He yanked out his gun, shoving it up against Savina's ribcage. "How many guards has she killed? I can't even remember anymore." The muzzle of the gun was hard and cold, and through the odd, sick dizziness, Savina could feel the outline of it, a small, bruising shape. She wasn't going to live through this. She was going to die here, and no one would ever know or care what had happened to her. The guard's captain shook his head reluctantly. Best not. It would be a shame to lose Reka after all this work. The words were still coming through the translator in Savina's wavelength, but everything had gone a bit hazy, and she couldn't spare the energy to interpret them. When her brain finally wandered back into focus, she was being dragged along the corridor, stumbling and whimpering at every step. It took her a few moments, in her pain-fogged state, to realize that they weren't going back towards the cells. The icy wash of panic at the thought was almost enough to jolt her from her stupor. Were they taking her somewhere to kill her? Then she remembered what the guard had said. Not killing her then, but not taking her back to the cell. She stumbled to a halt at one of the glass walls of the building, and the guard in the front of the procession opened an entryway and gestured them through. Savina blinked at the sudden shock of night air on her wet skin and clothing. Then she was dragged along a crowded, busy launch pad packed with ships until at last she was prodded up an open hatch. She stumbled up it, her stomach roiling in sick despair. The Yibo were getting ready to launch their ships. The portal was going to open. They'd been too late. Chapter 25. Alba. Alba glanced up with a start at a sharp buzzing, and she looked around, disoriented. "You've got to get out! You've got to get out! Right now!" It took her a moment to realize the voice was Aaand's, and it was coming through her wavelength. "The raiders are here." His tone was grim. "I didn't think they'd be this fast. Alba, you've got to get everyone out." She blinked herself awake and staggered to her feet. "Josip!" she snapped. "Felju, wake up! Everyone out, now!" Now that she was awake, she could see the bright light of the descending ship. "What the hell?" Niccolo's voice was groggy as he staggered out of his tent. "Out!" snapped Alba. "It's the raiders!" "Find somewhere to hide." It was Istvay this time, voice coming faintly through Aaand's line. "Best stay away from the ship that Aaand and I came in. I don't want them after you, too." "And what are you two going to do?" Josip had emerged from his tent, looking tired and older than his years. "We'll figure something out." Aaand's words were strained. "And it'll be a hell of a lot easier to figure something out if we're not worried about the rest of you," Istvay added. We can't just leave Aaand and Istvay," Inez began, her eyes wide. "You heard what Istvay said," snapped Felju. He sounded more like his old self than he had in a long time. Inez's voice was very quiet. I'm not sure that's an option anymore." Alba swung around to follow the girl's gaze and froze. A raider stood at the entrance to the camp, a few meters away. They were smiling, but it didn't look like a cheerful smile. "What have you done with the captain's humans?" The question came out sharp-edged and menacing. "I am not sure who you're talking about," said Alba, stepping forward. Her tone held its usual tartness, but her legs were strangely reluctant to take that step towards the raider. But if it could buy Aaand and Istvay time to get away, somehow... "If you're looking for someone, I would suggest..." "They're here," said the raider, their smile growing. "We saw the ship. Where are they?" The The captain wants them alive, I think, but I doubt the same holds for you." The others were watching Alba. She took a deep breath. "I'm sorry to say I really can't help you." "Well then." The raider stepped forward, grabbing Alba by the upper arm. Claws dug into her flesh, and she had to bite back a gasp of shock and pain. "Madam," came Feliu's horrified voice. And then there was a commotion from the other direction, the sound of running footsteps. Aaaaand and Istvay burst into the camp. They were both breathing heavily, and Istvay was staggering, their face drawn with effort. "Wait!" gasped Aaaaand. "Wait!" The raider turned, loosening their grip on Alba, and she staggered back. Nicolau caught her, but she shook him off, forcing herself to straighten. "Wait!" Aaaaand paused a moment, sucking in a breath. You're looking for us, aren't you?" The raider's expression had turned to one of dangerous delight. "There you are! The captain was not happy to find you gone." Aaaaand and Istvay exchanged glances. "I imagine he wasn't," Aaaaand murmured dryly. "Excellent," said the raider with a sharp smile. "I'll take you back then, and you can explain things to him. And best hope you catch him in a good mood. The rest of these we can—" "Aaaaand." The new voice was deep and menacing, and there was a threat in the words that needed no interpretation. Aaaaand took a deep breath and turned, and Alba caught the way Istvay's hand tightened protectively around his arm. "Captain Cravai," said Aaaaand. "Aaaaand! You hurt my feelings! You and your Istvay!" Ani squirmed on Aaaaand's shoulder, growling a warning. "I told you," said Aaaaand. His voice was quiet and hopeless. "We need to save our friends. If that portal opens, everyone we know back on Colorida will die." The captain frowned, starting across the clearing towards them. "Aaaaand, maybe you should be a little less concerned about your friends on Colorida, and a little more concerned about your own survival." He reached out a hand as if to grab Aaaaand by the shoulder, then seemed to remember something and dropped his hand hurriedly. "I'm sorry, I forgot. I gave up my chance to find a cure for my best friend." Aaaaand's voice was low. "Maybe you don't understand, but if you want to stop me from doing this, you'll have to kill me." Alba stared at the young scientist, a little taken aback. The raider captain seemed taken aback as well. "Aaaaand, you're a scientist. You know how prey species and predator species work. You can't fault us for—" "This has nothing to do with fault," Aaaaand broke in. "If you tried to hurt me, Ani would kill you. She doesn't give a damn about morality. She loves me, and she doesn't want me to get hurt. If any one of you tried to touch Istvay, you'd have to slit me open first. Because He glanced at his friend, who was standing beside him, their eyes wide. He cleared his throat, turning back to the raider captain. I care about them very much. I'm not going to argue with you about whether it's moral for you to kill the people on Colorida, but I won't stand by while you do it. So," he shrugged, "go ahead and kill me if you need to. That's the only way you're going to stop this." The raider captain glared at Aaaaand. At last, he sighed, turning to one of the raiders standing next to him. "We'll deal with these 3 later. Restrain them and put them on the ship. His Ani will try to kill you, so be careful." Something bright and sharp blazed across the sky. The raider captain glanced up, then swore. Aaaaand and Istvay exchanged grim looks. "What is it?" Alba snapped. Said Aaaaand. The other raiders, they want to kill us. I mean, even more than these ones do." Alba stared, her mind spinning. "If you'll excuse me for asking," began Josip, "exactly how many groups of raiders want to kill you?" "At least 2 more than we'd like," said Istvay. "Get out of here while you damn well can." "If Sharda thinks she can lay claim to my humans," the raider captain growled, turning to the raider beside him, "then she'd better think a little harder. Get Desi to watch the humans. The rest of us will take care of her. She's been getting a bit too confident lately." He snapped out orders, and raiders scattered, heading towards the small attack pods. In the distance, Alba could see the lights on the portal mechanism flaring up. Feliu must have noticed it as well. "Madam," he said quietly, Perhaps with the raiders here, they'll be distracted enough that, for a moment, Alba allowed herself to hope it was true. And then there was a flash of light, like a lightning strike, but 1,000,000 times more brilliant. Feliu gave a choked curse. "Madam," he started. Then, like fabric aged and weakened by use, the sky ripped apart, revealing a familiar black jag of nothingness. No. The word was soft and choked, and it took Alba a moment to realize that she was the one who'd said it. After everything they'd done, the exhaustion and the pain and the sacrifice, it couldn't be too late. It couldn't be. She could vaguely hear the shouts of the raiders around her, the hiss of weapons fire, the screams of the injured, but none of it seemed to register properly in her brain. All she could do was stare at the gaping black rent that moments before had glowed bright with pinprick lights of unfamiliar constellations. She'd always known, academically, that they were going to die here. If she managed to pull this off, if she managed to shut the portal down, she'd die in this alien, unfamiliar landscape, among unfamiliar people in an unfamiliar place. But she'd managed to push it all to the back of her mind, because it was for something greater than herself. Because this time, no matter how many mistakes she'd made in the past, this decision was the right one, the only one she could make in good conscience. She'd still die here now that she'd failed, but everyone in the Joias System would die too. The portal was open. They'd lost. Chapter 26. Aaaaand. Aaaaand stared at the gaping rift in the sky. He was still clutching Istvay's arm, and he realized it, but damn it, it hardly seemed to matter anymore. One of the raiders had grabbed the two of them and dragged them to the side of the clearing, but gently. Ani was still on his shoulder, her eye pouches bulged out threateningly. He'd been ready to tell her to go after the raiders, but it hardly seemed worthwhile now. It would just end up getting more people killed. "Maybe we can talk them into keeping Alba and the others alive anyway," Aaaaand whispered. Istvay's face was pale, but they gave him a wry smile. "Aaaaand, this isn't your fault. We did our best." Aaaaand took a deep breath. "I know," he mumbled. "We both did. It just wasn't enough." He sighed. "That's the thing, Pishti. It's not that I don't care about all of this. I'm a good scientist. That's all. I never had to worry about trying to change things I couldn't change." Istvay looked at him for a long moment. "If that's the case," they said at last, "why did you spend so long looking for a cure for me? You knew that was something you couldn't change. Why didn't you just give up?" "Because," Aaaaand said quietly, "I didn't want to live in a world where you didn't exist, because that was the one thing I wasn't willing to do." Istvay closed their eyes for a moment. "Aaaaand," they began. "Aaaaand, Istvay, listen." Aaaaand blinked at the unexpected voice, turning quickly. Desi stood beside them, looking nervous. "You want to close the portal and keep the humans from being wiped out, right?" Aaaaand nodded cautiously. "Well, go on," she hissed. "The captain left me to guard you. You can leave now if you're quick." Aaaaand stared at her. What about the others?" "They're back there in the woods," she whispered. "I sent them out already since I knew you'd insist on it." Aaaaand was still blinking in astonishment. Won't you get in trouble for this?" Desi shook her head in exasperation. "Let me deal with that. I've known the captain for a long time. I'll be able to talk him down. I'll just tell him your land devil creature tried to eat me or something. He knows I'm not a fighter." "Why are you—" Aaaaand began. "Because," she snapped, "I've tried to work with laboratory animals who are pining their hearts out, and they always just die. I can never get the data I need. And I'm confident that, no matter how much data you think you stole from me when you left, you're going to need more if you want to find your cure, so you're not going to run for good. So, if you swear that you'll come back when this is done, I'll promise to keep the captain from killing you for it. I get my data, you get your portal closed, we all win." Aaaaand stared at her, then turned to Istvay, who was also staring. He said at last. Yes, thank you." Desi looked relieved. "Back there," she hissed. "They're waiting for you in the trees. But don't forget, you promised to come back." "I promise," said Aaaaand fervently. He could still feel the ache of his decision to leave the small, neat research station to go after the portal. "Well, go on then." Aaaaand nodded in a stunned fashion, and Istvay dragged him out of the clearing and into the trees. Alba and the others were waiting a few meters in, as Desi had promised. "What in the mystery's name?" Alba began in a shaky voice, but Istvay shook their head briskly. "No time for that. If we want to get this portal taken down, we've got to go now." They turned to Aaaaand. "Aaaaand," they began in a softer voice. "Pishti, listen." He took a deep breath. "You know as well as I do that of the two of us, I'm the best one to do this. You get Alba and the others to safety. When you've done that, and they're somewhere safe, head back to the camp, and when I'm done with the portal mechanism, I'll meet you there." Istvay studied him for a long moment. Then, at last, they nodded. "You're right," they said quietly. "But if I'm not coming, you'll need to take someone with you." Aaaaand stared at them in panic, and they gave a small smile. "Aaaaand, I promise. I'd do this for you if I could, but I can't. Aaaaand swallowed hard. He could work on his own. And he could work with Istvay, because he knew Istvay almost as well as he knew himself. But he wasn't a leader. He wasn't about to take a group of people he didn't know, who looked up to him as some damn hero, into a situation he had no idea if he'd be able to get them out of again. Istvay was still watching him, and he could see the pain on their face. He tried to smile. "It's fine, Pishti. It'll be fine. You stay with the others. I'll be fine on my own. I have Ani with me anyways, and I'll go with you." Inez stepped forward. She looked just as nervous as he remembered, but there was a new determination in her face. "I can help. I grew up in the Rim Mountains, and I used to go hunting with my mom, and—" She shot a frightened, defiant look in Alba's direction. "And I'm not going to let my family get hurt. Not again." Aaaaand closed his eyes for a moment. "Aaaaand," whispered Istvay. He took a deep breath and nodded. "Thank you, Inez." "I'll come too," said Nicolau quickly, stepping forward. His face, too, was set and determined, if a little paler than usual. I let Joska and the others go off to rescue my sister without me. This is the least I can do." Aaaaand nodded again, trying to fight back the panic. He wasn't sure how well he was succeeding. "Aaaaand." Istvay stepped close, and Aaaaand glanced up at them, surprised for a moment, out of the spiraling terror in his brain. "They'll be able to help. I'll get the others somewhere safe, and we'll get a distraction ready. Set off a flare when you need it. I don't know how long we'll be able to keep things interesting over here, but we'll do our best." Aaaaand nodded. He couldn't seem to form words. Istvay stepped closer, putting a hand on his arm. Aaaaand was suddenly acutely aware of how close they were to him. "Aaaaand." Their eyes were wide and dark, and he could feel their hand tighten on his skin. He swallowed, unable to look away. Damn it. It didn't matter how often he did this. It didn't matter how many times he told himself this. He couldn't seem to... "We still haven't had our talk," Istvay whispered. So you need to come back to me, okay?" Aaaaand wasn't sure whether he was still breathing. "Okay?" It came out as a hoarse croak. "And, Aaaaand..." Istvay's voice was rough. They reached up, and Aaaaand watched, almost as if he were in a trance, felt their hand brush across his cheek, slide into his hair, their fingers cup around the back of his head. His heart was beating so that he thought it might actually break its way completely out of his chest. "Can I?" Istvay whispered, their other hand coming up to cup his jaw, their thumb brushing across his lips. For luck. For luck, Aaaaand managed, his voice almost inaudible. Very, very gently, Istvay tightened their hand into his hair, drawing his face close to theirs. They leaned in, their breath warm against Aaaaand's cheek. And then their lips brushed his, and he suddenly couldn't think or breathe or feel anything at all, except for the warmth and softness of their lips, that familiar, remembered pressure from years ago. Something warm and soft and intoxicating flowed through his entire body at their touch, his brain sparking and fizzing, his entire existence narrowed to Istvay's mouth on his. His hands had come up, resting on Istvay's hips, and he pulled Istvay towards him. The brush of their body against his set off another wave of sparks that threatened to overwhelm him completely, and he pulled them closer, leaning into the kiss. Istvay's breath was coming quick and unsteady, their fingers tightening in his hair, their lips parting. At last, Istvay drew back. Their eyes were wide, pupils large and dark, the rise and fall of their chest fast and uneven. Even in his addled state, Aaaaand could feel how their hand trembled against his skin. For a few moments, the two of them stared at each other. "For luck," Aaaaand repeated stupidly. Istvay managed a small smile. "Just come back to me, okay?" They turned away and Aaaaand swayed as their hand left his arm. "Aaaaand!" someone hissed. He blinked and realized it was Nicolau. "Come on, we need to go." It took a moment for Nicolau's words to penetrate the fog that was his brain, and when they did, it took a moment more to persuade himself that this was more urgent than the memory of Istvay's lips on his. He began, and then realized there was no way he would be able to force his brain into forming words at this point. Nicolau and Inez were shooting amused glances at each other. At last, Inez took him by the arm and tugged. "Aaaaand, let's get moving. We'll talk about our plan on the way." He stumbled after her, his brain slowly coming back to the problems at hand, but there was a dreamy smile that had painted itself across his face that he wasn't sure he'd be able to get rid of, even if he wanted to. Chapter 27. Savina. Savina could hardly think over the roaring in her ears, her mind not quite able to process what had happened. How had they been too late? It had been a desperate hope anyway. She'd always known it, but it was all they had. How had it been too late? She was dragged down the ship corridors to a small hatch in the back. There were a handful of guards at the entrance, but they stepped aside as Savina's guards approached, pulling the door open. Savina landed on the floor in a heap as the door slammed behind her. She lay there, dazed and dizzy in a sticky pool of her own blood. Hazily, she felt warm hands on her shoulder, a concerned voice whispering in her ear. But she couldn't really make out the words, and she figured she must be dreaming anyway. The hands slid around her gently, and she gave a little gasp of pain as she was lifted, like a small child. "Easy, Savina," the voice soothed, and she relaxed into the warmth. She remembered being carried like this by her mother when she was very small, back in the compound, when she was still young and innocent and trusting, before her life had been set on a road she'd never be able to turn back from. She felt herself laid on something soft, and someone was wiping the blood from her face, their touch surprisingly gentle. "Savina?" This time she recognized the voice, and her eyes blinked open in dull astonishment. Reka was leaning over her, the expression on her face one of unmistakable concern. "Reka?" she managed. Reka looked up, sucking in a quick breath. "You're conscious. I wasn't sure." Again, Savina caught what sounded like actual worry. She struggled into a sitting position, shoving Reka's hands away, although her own hands were almost too shaky. She wasn't about to do this again, let Reka's stupid fake concern cut through all of her defenses, send her sniffling in the corner about how hard her life had been. "I'm fine," she snapped. "Leave me alone. It's just a bloody nose." She had to stop for a moment, clenching her teeth against the nausea roiling in her stomach at the movement. "It looks like a bit more than a bloody nose." Reka's tone had regained its usual dryness. Savina scowled at her and pushed herself to her feet. The room spun, and she swayed, then a pair of strong arms caught her, lowering her gently onto the cot again. "Sit down, you little idiot! Where are you hurt?" "None of your damn business," Savina choked, biting back tears. Reka ignored her, looking her over carefully, then slid her hands gently down Savina's calf. Savina gasped as Reka's probing fingers touched the center of the throbbing pain. Reka sucked in a quick breath. "When did this happen?" "When the hell do you think?" Savina hissed. "They caught me in the corridor and they—" She cut off her words, biting down hard against the sick tears trying to well up in her eyes. Reka studied her for a moment, her eyes uncomfortably perceptive. At last she looked down at Savina's leg and sighed. "I'm sorry, this is going to hurt," she said. Are you ready? Before Savina could respond, there was a lightning jolt of pain in her leg, and she gave a little, muffled scream, her vision going momentarily blurry. Reka held up a jagged shard of sharp steel. I'm surprised you were still conscious, with this stuck into you. Savina stared at the bloody shard of metal, then turned away and vomited onto the floor at the foot of the bed. When she'd finished, she stayed where she was for a moment, the acid burn of vomit sharp in her throat, her eyes stinging with tears. She waited for Reka to say something cutting, but instead, the woman laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. Are you done? Then lie back. Let me tie this up so you don't bleed out. Savina swore weakly, but Reka ignored her, ripping a strip from the bottom of Savina's tunic and using it to bandage the wound. You'll need to get that cleaned out sooner or later, but this is the best I can do at present. At least it'll slow the bleeding, she said in her cool voice. Me bleeding to death isn't really our biggest worry right now. They're going to open the portal. I noticed. Reka's tone was, if possible, even drier than before. In fact, I hate to break it to you, but judging from the chatter over the lines, the portal is already open. Then why aren't you doing anything? Savina's voice was harsh, with a mixture of panic and tears. We need to stop this. I thought we were bloody well going to stop this. Reka leaned back on her heels where she sat crouched at Savina's feet and looked up at her with those piercing slate hazel eyes. Why does this mean so much to you? She asked at last. I thought you said you hated the whole Joias system. I do. I hate the whole damn thing. But... She closed her eyes for a moment, waiting until she was sure her voice would be steady. But my little brother might still be alive, and he's almost as much of an idiot as you are, Reka. He said he'd rather die on this side of the portal than see his stupid adoptive parents die. He's a stupid, naive little idiot. But I'm not going to let him get hurt again. Her words choked a little at the end, and she clamped her mouth shut. Reka studied her with an unreadable gaze. At last, she asked quietly, Hurt again? What happened to him? None of your damn business, she growled. I suppose it isn't, said Reka. For a while, they sat in silence. You? Asked Savina at last, when she couldn't bear the quiet anymore. Why do you want this so badly? You don't have a baby brother with an adoptive family in the Joias system, do you? No, said Reka, in an emotionless voice. I don't, but it's the right thing to do. Savina scoffed. The right thing to do. Reka ignored her, turning so her back was leaned against the cot. From outside, they could hear the sound of the Yibo fleet preparing for departure, the muffled shouts, the sound of heavy objects being moved, punctuated by occasional curses. As I said, from the sounds of it, the portal's already open, said Reka at last, not looking over at Savina. We can't stop that. And we can't save the humans on this side of the portal. We're too late for that, too. But we may have one last option to do something. Savina frowned. Well, she asked at last, what is it? Reka turned to look at her at last, a small, humorless smile on her face. She reached into the pocket of her suit and pulled out another explosive, twin to the one Savina had used in the water pipes in the government building. The Yibo military formations are pretty closely packed. Here on the loading pad, the ship we're on isn't particularly important, but we're close to a formation of heavy gunships. I analyzed the composition of the fuel they use with my wavelink. If we plant this in the ship's fuel supply and set it off, the resulting explosion should at least take a few of them with us. It doesn't solve our problem, but... She shrugged. Maybe it will give the Joias system at least a bit more of a chance. Savina stared at Reka for a long time. She felt very cold. Why do you want to do this so badly, really? She asked softly at last. Reka turned away. It doesn't really matter why, does it? What matters is whether it's worth it for you. Because I can't do it by myself. For a while, Savina just watched her. This would be her and Reka's death. And for what? If Nicolau had survived the portal opening, it wasn't like this would affect him personally. If the Yibo went through with their bargain, maybe his stupid adoptive mother and father might get sucked into whatever hell Kavako had planned. But Nicolau would be fine. She remembered the look on Joska's face back on the outskirts of the small Yibo village. I have a niece down on Colorida, and if I'm trapped here in exchange for keeping her alive, giving her a chance at a life that I never quite got, as much as I tried for it? It was a stupid sentiment. The farmer back in the Rim Mountains hadn't needed to take in the small, dirty bundle Savina had left on her doorstep 20 years ago, and even if she had taken him in, she hadn't had to raise him like her own, abandon her farm to keep him safe when he was in danger. Her life would have been far easier if she hadn't. But she'd given Nicola something that Savina couldn't and would never be able to. And Joska, too. What family did she have back in Colorida? The only one Savina knew about was the niece who'd gotten into trouble. A niece who Joska loved enough that she was willing to give a second chance to a murderer, a thief, and a ship hijacker, just because Savina reminded her of the girl. It was a stupid, stupid sentiment, but she had a quick flash of memory the evenings in Yur's safe house. Her, Nicolau, Benny, Joska, and Rafael chatting or playing dice or simply relaxing in comfortable silence after a long day's labor. Maybe, after all, she was just as stupid as all those people she looked down on for their sentiment. Because she'd do anything at all, including what Reka was suggesting, to stop the look on Joska's face. If the woman lived through all this, when she found out her niece had been killed. To give Nicolau back that gleam of hope as he realized his adoptive parents were safe, no matter what was going to happen to him. "All right," she said quietly. "This is probably the stupidest thing I've ever done, but all right. I'll help you." Reka turned to look at her, her expression unreadable. "What about you?" asked Savina, as she pushed herself carefully to her feet. Pain jolted up her body as she put weight on her injured leg, but it was dampened by the tight bandage Reka had tied. "Do you have anyone back there you're going to miss?" "No." Savina glanced at Reka in surprise, but her expression forbade further questions, and she was hit with a sudden, small jolt of pity. No one in Colorida that Reka would miss. Savina wished that was true for her. It wasn't. It didn't make sense, of course. All her worst fears, her deepest hatreds, were caught up in her memories of the compound. Her memories of her family, of her mother, who'd been willing to bury her son alive, and mixed in with the hate and the anger and the frustration, a sick, bittersweet nostalgia, homesickness, love and hate, resentment and bitterness and longing, all wrapped together in the same tangled mass. And Reka didn't have even that, if what she was telling Savina was true. "All right," said Savina. "No point in putting it off, I guess." She took a tentative step, and her leg almost buckled. Reka put out an arm to steady her, and Savina grabbed it without thinking. Reka's skin was warm, her touch surprisingly gentle. Savina scowled and dropped her hand deliberately. "The fuel storage is on the second floor down," said Reka, as if nothing had happened. "We'll have to get past the guards by the door without them sounding the alarm. But it should be fairly straightforward from there, like I said. This isn't carrying anything too important, and it shouldn't be guarded heavily. We'll need to be quick. Once they get into the air, I'm not sure they'll stay in close enough formation for us to do any damage." Savina nodded, trying not to think too hard on the implication of Reka's words. It wasn't like she hadn't been close to dying plenty of times on this damn trip, mostly thanks to the woman next to her. But it didn't make the terror go away. "Do you have a knife?" asked Reka. Savina nodded. "And I have my pistol. Between the two of us, the guards shouldn't be a problem. It'll just be a matter of getting from there down to the fuel storage before they call in enough backup to kill us. I'll send a copy of the map through to your wavelink in case one of us doesn't make it." Savina nodded again, a tight mixture of anticipation and fear bubbling in her stomach. "I should call Joska," she whispered. "See if they're still all right. Let her know what we're doing so they can take advantage of it." Reka glanced at her, then nodded. Savina tried to ignore the way her stomach twisted. She wasn't actually calling to warn Joska, much as she might tell herself so. She was calling because she wanted to hear the voice of one person who actually cared about her before she died. Maybe Joska would let her talk to Benny and Nicolau for a minute, although she wasn't sure if that would make things better or worse. There was silence as the wavelength buzzed. And then, at last, she heard Joska's voice, and a flood of relief washed over her. "Savina!" Joska's words were tense. "I've been trying to get a hold of you for the past standard hour, but you weren't answering." Savina frowned, then remembered the hazy delirium of pain after she'd been captured. "Sorry," she muttered. I was busy." She paused. "Listen, Joska," she said at last. "The portal's either open or about to, and the Yibo have taken us onto the ship, but—" She swallowed hard. "But there's one last thing we can do. We're going to blow the ship up. The loading pad is packed tightly enough that we may be able to take out a few of the Yibo gunships. If they stop to figure out what's going on, it might give you a chance to get the portal shut down still." She cleared her throat. "And, I'm not sure if it's good news or bad news, but I'm not going to make it out. So tell Benny and Nicolau—" She stopped, her voice choking off. There was a long moment of silence from the other end of the wavelength, then Joska's wry voice. "Savina." There was an unfamiliar emotion in her tone. Savina blinked. "That can't have been an easy decision for you to make. I'll be sure and tell Nicolau and Benny what you were willing to do for them, but—" She paused, a hint of humor creeping into her voice. "But I'm going to ask you to refrain from blowing up the ship just yet, since Rafael and Benny and I are on it. While I don't relish the thought of being blown sky high, perhaps the more relevant fact is we've hijacked the ship, so we may be able to find a way to keep the Yibo busy that doesn't involve all of us being killed." Savina stared at her wavelength, almost unable to process what she was hearing. "Now, if you can, take out the guards, although I'd prefer you not kill anyone unless strictly necessary, and come up to the cockpit. We'll see if we can discuss plans that don't involve any of us dying."